Chapter 1453. Emperor Zhao Zhuan did not make a sound. He was not a son of heaven who would slack off in governance. He was very familiar with the Guangling Dao War. Right now, there was only one thing that made it difficult for him to choose. Should he let the two navies at the front and back delay the opportunity, and first help the 10,000 tigers and wolves of the southern border cross the Guangling River? Or should he take advantage of the West Chu Navy taking the initiative to fight a decisive battle with the Guangling Navy and have the Qingzhou Navy quickly enter the empty area at the western end of Bailu Lake so that they could fight a more secure pincer battle on the eastern side of Bailu Lake and not fall into a situation where the West Chu Navy would attack them one by one? Of course, as long as the Nanjiang soldiers successfully crossed the Guangling River, Song Li, who had just entered the capital not long ago, had destroyed most of the West Chu soldiers. Then, on the land of West Chu, the 100,000 elite Nanjiang soldiers would be unstoppable. They even had the hope of surrounding the capital of West Chu. However, from the start, the Guangling Rebellion was not a battle purely for victory. Once the 100,000 soldiers of Nanjiang surrounded the capital of West Chu without losing a single soldier, then the victory on Bailu Lake would become an unnecessary battle. If Nanjiang only destroyed the country before the court, that was fine. The worst result was that it was far beyond what the court could bear. If the Guangling Navy and the Qingzhou Navy lost to the West Chu Navy personally led by Cao Chongqing, if Zhao Bing, who was a border king like Su Shao in the past, had ill intentions and disobeyed the situation, then could the Southern Expedition Commander Lu Xingxiang, who only had tens of thousands of men and horses, stop the wolves of Nanjiang that had been in battle for a long time? What was even more terrifying was that the southern border and West Chu were colluding and heading north together. In that case, Li Yang could only have Gu Jiantang divide his troops between the two Liao border armies and head south to protect Graydon City. The northern Mang had never fought smoothly on the two fronts of northern Liang and Yuliang to begin with, and there were also close to 200,000 soldiers stationed outside the two Liao lines of defense. Could it be that he, Zhao Zhuan, really had to stand on top of Graydon City and see the northern Mang barbarians and the barbarians of the southern border at the same time? However, all these deductions were built on the premise of the worst-case scenario. Therefore, Zhao Zhuan felt some regret in the depths of his heart. Back then, he had listened to the opinions of the head of the Secretariat Qi Yanglong and the Minister of War Lu Baijie and refused to send troops to Western Shu. Was it wrong? After all, there were only 10,000 Shu soldiers. Even if Chen Zhibao personally led them, how much merit could they take away on the Guangling Road? Could 10,000 people besiege West Chu's capital? Although it was the young emperor's original intention to not have the king of Shu come out of Shu, when the battle situation became muddy, it was hard to avoid some well-hidden anger. Zhao Zhuan, an emperor who had everything going smoothly, lacked experience in making decisions. After all, he was not as good as the previous emperor and could not be compared to his grandfather who had spent most of his life fighting on horseback. At this time, Zhao Zhuan found the Tangxi sword immortal Lu Baijie, who he could not order around as he pleased, more and more of an eyesore. If not for the fact that the two assistant ministers of the Ministry of War, Su Gong and Tang Taizuang, were new faces in Graydon City, Song Li's experience was too shallow, and those old generals with merit had either died in battle or died of old age. The emperor would have had Lu Baijie leave the Ministry of War a long time ago. Yuan Guo was immediately preparing to head to the vassal state to be the new Jidu deputy of the court. Lu Baijie should have been in the ranks, but Qi Yanglong and Tantanon, the two main officials, both expressed their intentions that this matter was inappropriate, which was why it was delayed. Ever since he ascended the throne, Zhao Zhuan had his own calculations. In his view, the previous emperor should not have followed Yuan Benshi and Zhang Julu's wishes and released Chen Zhibao like a tiger back to the mountain. He should have firmly nailed him to the position of Minister of War. At the very most, he would have given him a military achievement in the Guangling battle. Taking a step back, the same tens of thousands of soldiers. The court did not believe that Chen Zhibao could contend against the Nanjiang army. Perhaps no one doubted that as long as Chen Zhibao remained in the capital as the Minister of War, the Nanjiang army would not have any thoughts of rebellion. It was not that Zhao Zhuan did not understand the previous emperor's original intentions in placing Chen Zhibao in Western Shu. However, Zhao Zhuan was not someone who blindly admired and trusted this adopted son of Su Shao. He had a deep suspicion of this white-clothed military saint. Furthermore, as the new monarch, Zhao Zhuan had to admit that the previous emperor and Chen Jibao had a relationship. Everyone knew that the previous emperor did not have a good impression of all of Biyao, but he favored Chen Jibao greatly. Back then, he had almost bestowed the title of king of a different surname on that young man before he was even a year old. Later on, he even had him replace Gu Jiantang as the Minister of War. In the end, he was 10 years late and still let Chen Jibao become the king of Shu. After Su Zhao's death, he became the only remaining king of a different surname. Zhao Zhuan, on the other hand, did not have such a relationship between monarch and subject. The only people who had such a relationship with him were people like Chen Wang, Tang Taizuang, and Song Li, who were still a little below the level of top civil and military officials. The emperor was silent for a long time, so the entire hall could only be silent. Gao Tingshu spoke a few thousand words until his mouth was dry and his tongue was dry. He had truly emptied his stomach of the strategic plans he had prepared long ago. He no longer dared to boast and digress in front of the central officials. After carefully glancing at Liu Baijie, who was the backbone of the Ministry of War, he received a look of affirmation. Gao Tingshu thus shut his mouth and did not add to the painting of a snake with feet. The emperor finally broke the silence and said a few words of encouragement and praise to this new official of the Ministry of War who had many stories in the capital. It could be said that this was in the emperor's heart. All of the important officials in the hall smiled as they looked at this handsome young man with the nickname of Tian Jade Tree. Only the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights, Jean Lanting, had a hidden and complicated gaze. The emperor then left the Zhejian and went to the new location of the Hanlin Academy, which was neighbors to the two yamens of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Today, there was a tea party in the Hanlin Academy. As expected, the emperor saw Chen Wang, Sun Yin, Yan Qiji, Fan Zhangho, Li Jifu, and Song Kelly. Of course, there were more than these 6 people in the courtyard. There were dozens of young and old men in the Hanlin Academy, but no matter how they gathered together, they still could not be seen by the emperor at a glance. At this time, the arrogant scholar Sun Yin was discussing a game with Fan Shiduan, Fan Zhangho. Chen Wang and the top scholar, Li Jifu, stood side by side on one side, whispering to each other. The current dynasty's uncle-in-law, Yan Qiji, and the young phoenix of the Song family, Song Kelly, who had made a comeback, stood together on the other side. The emperor walked over to take a look. In the end, he saw that there were a few rare books placed near the chest jars in Sun Yin and Fan Zhangho's hands. Sun Yin's hands were slightly higher, with 4 books, while Fan Zhangho's hands only had 2 books. It seemed that they were betting on chess. After seeing the emperor's arrival, not to mention the other men in the courtyard who were in fear and trepidation, these 6 people's expressions were more or less the same. There were some small differences. Sun Yin didn't move at all. He only focused on the chess game. Fan Zhangho also didn't get up. This new young man, who had originally raised his arm and was pondering, slowly put down the chess piece between his fingers to show his respect. Yan Qiji and Song Kelly both made way. Especially Yan Qiji, who had the most right to be indifferent, his expression was the most serious and respectful. His expression seemed to be even more forceful than Song Kelly's. Chen Wang walked forward in small steps. After taking 2 steps, he found that Li Jifu didn't move. He quietly reached out and tugged on the top scholar's sleeve. Li Jifu gave him a grateful glance. The 2 of them came to the front of the emperor. Chen Wang smiled and explained to the emperor, it was agreed a few days ago that Yuetian would let Sun Yin play 2 pieces. Including them, a total of 6 people would use 3 months' salary to buy books from Gu Fang Zhangho to bet. Speaking of this, Chen Wang's smile grew wider. This idea was proposed by Sun Yin. It's obvious that he wants to cheat me. Who doesn't know that my salary is the most out of the 6 of them? Then Chen Wang moved slightly to make Li Jifu more eye-catching in front of the emperor. He joked, Li Jifu has always sent his salary back to his hometown. At most, he would have some loose change left. Thus, this time, he bought the books on credit with me. When he placed the bet, he was the most unhappy. He was worried for a long time, afraid that after the end of the year with great difficulty, he would owe someone a butt of debt again. Your Majesty, this humble subject has a presumptuous request. If Li Jifu and I lose, can your Majesty help us make up for it? Your Majesty's family is so big that this humble subject and Li Jifu can't compare to it. Chapter 1454. The emperor smiled and said, "What's so difficult about that? But then again, I have a large family business, but is your father-in-law Qin Xiaobao's family business small? Over the past 6 months, Prince Chai has been making a lot of money every day, making me want to take advantage of him. So I'll help Li Jifu pay off his debt." "Sure, I'll help you, but don't even think about it." Li Jifu was sandwiched between the monarch and his official. In that instant, all sorts of feelings welled up in his heart. He envied the emperor's unique trust in Qin Xiaobao. Otherwise, he would not have bluntly exposed Prince Chai's wantonly amassing of wealth. However, Li Jifu's heart was filled with gratitude for Qin Wang's secret support. After the emperor asked about the bet, he took off a jade pendant from his waist and pulled out the rare Gu Fangzhai book that Li Jifu had bet on next to Sun Yin's hand. He handed it back to the Zhuangyuan. After Li Jifu took the book, his eyes reddened for no reason. Holding the book with both hands, he quickly lowered his head, his eyes moist. The emperor patted this young subject who had the best ranking in the imperial examination, but whose reputation was at the bottom, and comforted him. "You haven't lost yet, have you?" But in the end, Qin Wang, Li Jifu, Yan Qiji, and Song Kelly were the losers. Sun Yin, who had lost, and Fan Zhangho, who had won, not only took back their own books, they also divided up the 3 books from the 4 people before them and the priceless jade pendant. Sun Yin took 2 rare books first, and Fan Zhangho could only take 1 book and the jade pendant. Seeing this scene, the emperor didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "It's fine if Yue Tian bet on himself winning, but Sun Yin, so you bet on yourself losing?" Sun Yin smiled faintly. Playing chess and betting are 2 different things. The emperor looked at the number 1 chess master of the dynasty, Fan Zhangho, and said helplessly, "The dignified Fan Sherdan is willing to negotiate with this scoundrel?" Fan Zhangho stood up and smiled, "Your Majesty, the 2 sides are actually equal in strength, and the outcome will depend on the will of the heavens." The emperor joked, "Everyone says that when you, Fan Yuetian, play chess, you seem to have the help of a celestial being behind you. So, in the future, when you play chess with Sun Yin, you must bring me along. I will bet on one of the books in the 6 libraries." Dusk gradually approached. Under the emperor's personal instructions, the eunuchs brought in many jars of fine wine from the palace. However, the emperor called for Qin Wang, Sun Yin, and his brother-in-law, Yan Qiji. The 4 of them walked out of the noisy courtyard together. The emperor turned his head to Sun Yin, who had lost the game but won the prize, and casually asked, "I only heard that there was a note. Why did you let me start?" Sun Yin replied, "No matter how many posts I post, I can't beat Fan Zhangho. If the disparity is too great, there's no point in betting." The emperor nodded and said, "Alcohol tolerance, chess ability, poetry, and taste are 3 things. After reaching a certain level, to take another step forward is as difficult as ascending to the heavens. It can be said that it was determined in one's previous life, and is not something that can be increased or decreased by human strength." Qin Wang said in a soft voice, "This is just like the Guangling Road War. If the West Chu evildoers did not place 2 or 3 pieces on the chessboard first, no one would have personally gone up or placed a bet." The emperor sighed and said somewhat helplessly, "The reason I pulled you 2 along is because you, Qin Wang, have always been optimistic about the Guangling War, while Sun Yin is the complete opposite. Today, I want to hear your inner thoughts. You 2 speak. No matter how shocking your words are, I will calm my heart and think carefully. The quarrels in the imperial court are inevitably mixed in with all kinds of related interests, but you 2 are not the same." Sun Yin glanced at Qin Wang. The latter gently extended his hand, indicating for Sun Yin to speak first. Sun Yin did not hold back. With a kind of boldness, he said, "Your Majesty is worried that after the Nanjiang army crosses the river and encircles West Chu's capital, it will become too big to be shaken. Even if it doesn't rebel, it will be enough to raise the price and demand an exorbitant price from the imperial court, to the point of becoming a second Biyao frontier army, right? Furthermore, the same structure, different situation. Back in Biyao, Su Shao, for whatever reason, did not divide the river to rule. However, the Prince of Yanqi, Zhao Bing, has painstakingly operated in Nanjiang for more than a decade. Whether or not he will make a different choice, who knows? Your Majesty doesn't want to give the initiative to others and give it to the illusory human heart and the will of heaven, right? The emperor hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Sun Yin smiled. There are 3 ways to break the situation. First, Your Majesty needs to publicly disapprove of the Ministry of War's muddle-headedness and be furious. You need to have the current Minister of War, Liu Baijie, resign and leave the capital to serve as the Judici of Nanjiang or Guangling. In short, you need to be able to see the deputy commander of the Nanjiang army, Wu Zhongshuan. You need to move him emotionally, reason with him, and promise him benefits. As for the 2 things, Sun Yin doesn't need to say much. Presumably, with Tangxi's sword Immortal's grace and cultivation, she is more than qualified. However, the word benefits will require Your Majesty to cut your flesh. The pain is not something a jade pendant on your waist can compare to. The emperor frowned. Is a judici enough? Sun Yin boldly sneered. The emperor said softly, promise that Wu Zhongshuan will enter the capital and become the Minister of War in the future? Sun Yin laughed coldly. The emperor asked, is my Liang going to have another prince with a different surname? Sun Yin asked back, why not? How can the future prince with a different surname be mentioned in the same breath as the Prince of Liang and Prince of Shu? How can the imperial court not be able to handle him? Wu Zhongshuan is already 60 years old, his 3 sons are mediocre and unaccomplished. How many years can he, Wu Zhongshuan, be the vassal prince? The emperor nodded, but did not say anything. Sun Yin continued, secondly, after Liu Baijie stepped down as the Minister of War, allow the Prince of Shu to take 10,000 elite troops out of the country. Moreover, issue an imperial decree to take the title of Minister of War and rush to Guangling Road to quell the rebellion. It is possible to allow Chen Jibao to give half of the Qingzhou navy under the command of the King of Jing'an, Zhao Sun, to him. Chen Jibao cannot wield great power, but at the same time, he cannot not wield it. If his military power is too heavy, it will be difficult to suppress his ambition. If he does not wield the least bit of military power, he will be resentful and have the intention to rebel. The number of troops given to Chen Jibao is 30 to 40,000, but it cannot exceed 50,000. Just because the imperial court does not allow him to leave Shu, does he really think that Chen Jibao can only train 10,000 troops? It is better to let the water out than to block it. The late emperor and Liang have already done a good deed by allowing him to go to western Shu. Beimang's million-strong army is pressuring Beiliang's western front. Thus, it is time to move Chen Jibao back under the nose of the capital. This time, the emperor grunted in agreement. Sun Yin took a deep breath. Lastly, it is to let Beiliang go all out and fight Beimang to the death. Not only must the imperial court release Guangling's water transport, but they must also stop the changing of titles. Moreover, they must have Gu Jiantang and Ji Zhou on the eastern front send troops to suppress Beimang's frontlines and drive the wolf to swallow the tiger. In this way, no matter how bad the Guangling Road War is, it will only be a small matter of winning or losing. In the end, Liang will be able to clean up the mess. At that time, Beimang will at most have half of its national strength left, and West Chu will be even more dilapidated and spent. Qiao Chongqing will only be asking for death. The young emperor muttered to himself and looked at Chen Wang. The latter smiled bitterly and said, I have nothing to say. Sun Yin waited for the emperor to continue, but he did not get the answer he wanted. He chuckled and said, I'm going back to drink. If I pass out in the Hanlin Academy, I'll have to trouble Chen Xiaobao to drag me back. The emperor looked at the back of this arrogant scholar and said softly, Chen Wang, Qiji, I'll take you to a place to meet someone. This time, the emperor did not even have any guards accompanying him. Only Song Tonglu, the head of the ceremony directorate, carefully led the way. After many twists and turns, they arrived at a secluded courtyard at the edge of the palace. After pushing open the courtyard door, Chen Wang and Yan Qiji saw an unfamiliar man and woman sitting on two rattan chairs. The man seemed to be blind, and the woman was reading a book to him. Even though Chen Wang and Yan Qiji were close to the emperor, they were still left at the courtyard door with Song Tonglu. The emperor walked in alone and had a short conversation with the blind young man. When the emperor got up and walked back to the courtyard door, he was not as serious as before. His face was more relaxed and relaxed. Chen Wang smiled and said, "Congratulations, Your Majesty. You have one more schemer." The emperor laughed heartily and said, "Chen Xiaobao is not any worse than him. They're just two different people. Sun Yin is not a worldly person, but he practices the wild fox Zen. The scholar surnamed Lu in the courtyard is a true worldly person, a wild fox spirit. But to truly rule the country and pacify the world, it still depends on you, Chen Wang." In the courtyard, the blind Lu Su was lying on a rattan chair. The female warrior of Jing and Palace, whose real name was Lu Lingbao, knelt in front of the emperor for not long. When she got up, her face was full of confusion. Lu Su asked softly, "Are you wondering why I want to kill Bailiang?" The woman who had followed Mr. Lu all the way smiled and said, "You must have your reasons." Lu Su opened his eyes, as if he wanted to see with his own eyes this world where no one was free. Chapter 1455. Su Fengnian knew that there would be a battle between him and Tuoba Bodhisattva, but he did not expect it to be so soon. Su Fengnian helped the old monk who gave him the Buddha bowl to bury him. He piled up the grave, erected a monument, and used his finger as a knife to carve the words, "Grave of the monk in chicken soup." He wanted to add an epitaph, but he did not know the content of the song called Falling Lotus, so he could only give up. After doing all this, Su Fengnian had no choice but to look for two suitable weapons. However, after hesitating for a long time, he realized that this trivial matter was unusually difficult. Su Fengnian even had the leisure to squat in front of the grave and sigh. In the past, only by risking one's life could one be qualified to gamble with one's life. For example, when he faced the devil Xia Ling from the Duck Head Green Inn, Tuoba Chunsan who had two powerful retainers, Diwu Raccoon, Yang Taisui, and the others, as well as when he faced Huang Qing with Sword Aura and a Beimang True Dragon, Su Fengnian did not think much about it. In fact, he did not have time to think deeply about it. It was like a battle between a cavalry and a scout, where life and death were decided. As for the human cat Han Xingxian and Wang Xianji, Su Fengnian had enough time to plan. However, those calculations seemed to be on the edge and he did not dare to be distracted. The only exception was the fight with Tuoba Bodhisattva. Once the fight was unavoidable and there was a few hours to half a day of leisurely travel, Su Fengnian did not have any complicated feelings. Instead, he felt somewhat relaxed, as if he was waiting for a friend he had never met before. Presumably, after seeing Tuoba Bodhisattva for the first time, Su Fengnian guessed that he might not be able to hold back his laughter and say, "You're here." Then, Su Fengnian thought that this question did not display the demeanor of a master. As one of the four grandmasters of the world, since the two of them were going to fight to the death, there was an 80 to 90% chance that one of them would die. Since they were going to fight to the death upon meeting, shouldn't there be a more heroic greeting? For example, Tuoba Bodhisattva, you've been the second in the world for decades, so you're going to die with this laughable title? Or perhaps they could bring 2 jars of wine over and drink before the fight. However, the spy report did not mention whether Tuoba Bodhisattva drank or not. What if this guy did not drink at all? Could he tell him not to fight first and wait for him to drink before fighting? However, Su Fengnian did not have the capacity to finish 2 jars of wine in 2 breaths. Wandering alone in front of the thatched cottage tomb, Su Fengnian suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He felt that he could really fight with wine. Even if Tuoba Bodhisattva did not drink, he could just say that whoever died, the living would offer a jar of wine to the deceased as a farewell. This kind of speech not only had the air of an expert, but also the spirit of an expert who lived and died like a guest traveling far away. The 6-jewel Bodhisattva on Mount Lantua, who had heard the news, saw the young lord squatting there and laughing secretly. She was dumbfounded. What was going on? Don't you know that the entire Lantua mountain is about to explode? She calmed herself down and said with a cold face, the first group of 20,000 monk soldiers near Lantua mountain can be gathered in 2 days and rushed to Liuzhou. Su Fengnian walked into the thatched cottage and brought 2 small wooden stools under the eaves. He threw one to her and the 2 of them sat together in the afterglow of the setting sun. He smiled and said, "You guys are really insincere. The prayer wheel has already been pushed, but you still want to wait for me to defeat Tuoba Bodhisattva before sending the troops?" The 6-jewel Bodhisattva did not hide anything. 1 generation after another, at most 300 to 400 years of life. But do you know how long Lantua mountain has existed in the world? Su Fengnian stared at her face that seemed to be unmarked by time. Back then, the top 10 aristocratic families of the spring and autumn period also thought the same. They always felt that the throne of the country could be broken, but the family's incense could not be extinguished. I originally thought that the monks of Lantua mountain would be more worldly. She sneered and said, "If they were worldly, why would our Lantua mountain care about you, king of Biyao? Why would we get involved in this mess? Don't push your luck." Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "Who said that worldly affairs means closing the door and hiding in the outer mountains of sky beyond mountain and not caring about the secular world? Your Lantua mountain's worldly affairs are very impressive, and I am convinced. But the Wudang Taoist monks left the mountain to cultivate, and the 2 Zen temples cultivate Buddhism for a day, which I admire even more. Whether it was Wudang's immortal or Liang Chan temple's Buddha, it was just the scenery on the other side of the river. They had also found ferries. They would cross the river as many feet as they could, and they would carry as many people as they could. Moreover, they never accepted money from others, nor did they mind drowning. They only wanted to carry 1 more person. No wonder the useless monk wanted to leave Lantua mountain. If he stayed on the mountain, he would only be Lu Songtao for the rest of his life." The 6-jewel Bodhisattva said expressionlessly, "How can the 1,000-year Lantua mountain's dharma be destroyed by a few words from Su Fengnian? At the end of the day, you are still thinking about the tens of thousands of monk soldiers. Stop pretending." Su Fengnian sighed and said, "Our paths are different, and we speak the same language." The 6-jewel Bodhisattva frowned and said, "Tuoba Bodhisattva is on his way here, aren't you going to run? You have only absorbed the remaining spring and autumn fate, do you really think you have recovered to your peak state?" Su Fengnian rolled his eyes and said, "I am the only one holding a lantern in this pitch-black night. Do you think Tuoba Bodhisattva is blind? The east is Bailiang's territory, and I can't run there. Go north to Gusai Prefecture. I think the Beimang Empress and the Taiping Commandant will treat me with good wine and meat. Or is the west further west? What's the point? As for the south? Qin Jibao and Xia Guining should have smelled the fishy smell." Su Fengnian's expression was calm. "Why run? Let's fight first. It's not like I will definitely lose or die. Besides, I have always wanted to be in Jianghu. The first time I was in Jianghu, it felt like real Jianghu. It was just that I was not happy at all. I was like a dog paddling in Jianghu, and I often choked on water. Unfortunately, after a few times, I became more and more capable, but I did not see myself as a Jianghu person. This time, I plan to walk Jianghu for myself. I will not paddle across the river, nor cross the lake by boat. I want to float across freely." The 6-pearl Bodhisattva glanced at the inconspicuous grave where the chicken soup monk was buried and said indifferently, "If you die in the west at the hands of Tuoba Bodhisattva, it might be difficult for others to collect your corpse." Su Fengnian said seriously, "A child's words carry no harm." The 6-pearl Bodhisattva looked at the imposing manor in the east that ordinary people could not see. "Tuoba Bodhisattva is in a hurry to kill you." Su Fengnian did not look at the magnificent scene. There would be plenty of opportunities to admire it later. Perhaps Su Fengnian could not bear not to look at it. He would vomit if he looked. Su Fengnian said to himself, after Li Chungang returned to Jianghu, "The old man went with me back to Bailiang for a while before we left." Before we left, he used 2 words to describe Jianghu people. He said that Wang Mingyin, who was ranked 11th in the world, was calm and steady, like a mighty river in front of him. Xianyuan Jingxing in the great snow plains was reserved. He did not use a single word, but he was romantic. Qi Xuanzhen on the devil-slaying platform was ancient. The moon rose from the east, and the cool breeze followed. Zhao Shituan of the Dragon Tiger Mountain was broad-minded. He lived for 100 years. Dong Tai was strong and vigorous. His spirit was like a rainbow, and he walked through clouds and wind. Qiao Changqing was sad and indignant. He lived for 100 years, and his thoughts were cold and disheartened. Wang Xianji was old but strong. He was in the best state. He could be said to be the first grade of vigorous. The sky was full of wind and waves, and the sea and mountains were vast. His spirit was full, and all things were by his side. The six-pearl bodhisattva patiently listened to him ramble on about the stories of his old friends. In fact, she was listening with great interest. After all, if she had not appeared here today, these stories would probably rot in someone's stomach for the rest of their lives. Su Fengnian suddenly asked, "Are there any good weapons on Mount Lantua? It would be best if they were swords. If there are any divine weapons, you can lend them to me." The Bodhisattva of 6 pearls looked at the scene in the east and shook her head. There are an ancient sword called Fang Sheng and a blade called Qi Yun. They were both forged in the Dafeng dynasty. However, Tuoba had already found you by the time I came and went. Su Fengnian smiled. At most, I'll let Tuoba wait for you to arrive before starting the fight. If he doesn't agree, I'll run toward Mount Lantua. I'll be able to wait for you to get the sword. Oh right, while I'm fighting with Tuoba, help me keep an eye on Wang Weishue, who is currently in the Dong family in the inner city. As long as he doesn't leave the western region, you don't have to interfere. The Bodhisattva of 6 pearls stood up slowly. Her gaze was complicated. Why don't you disperse your fate energy? Tuoba will lose his target. You don't have to fight this battle. Su Fengnian said helplessly, how long has it been since the old monk was buried? Aren't you afraid that he'll jump out and smash your face with a bowl? You're not afraid, but I am. Moreover, my intuition tells me that if we fight here today, it might be more advantageous and have a higher chance of winning than if we fight in the future. If we avoid him now, even if we recover our cultivation in the future, our state of mind will be weaker. She sneered. In the end, you, Su Fengnian, still want to take advantage of the vast battlefield in the western region to fight to your heart's content. What intuition are you talking about? Su Fengnian smiled awkwardly. Then, he looked angry and embarrassed. He glared at her and said, don't hit my face when you're fighting, and don't expose my shortcomings when you're scolding. The Bodhisattva of 6 pearls disappeared in a flash. Su Fengnian sat alone on the stool. Chapter 1456. Little Lantua Mountain was the backyard of one of the 3 families in the inner city, King of Hell Sima family. However, the Dong family had launched a bloody massacre that had been planned for a long time. Almost half of them survived overnight. However, a centipede dies but never falls down. After the Dong family hit a wall with the young drunkard on the roof, especially when the young master of the Aquarius state heard that chicken soup monk had given an alms bowl to Tai Mu Dai, the young swordsman who had once assassinated Yan Wenluan with his sect, the Great Yu House, came to the thatched cottage at the foot of the mountain. The cautious Wang Weishue mistook him for a protective amulet that the old monk had pasted on the Sima family's door. Therefore, he ordered the Dong family's assassins to stop pursuing the Sima family. Su Fengnian, who was sitting leisurely on the bench, also felt the strength and resilience of the city. The Sima family was already in a miserable state. If it were a family in the Central Plains, the monkeys would have fled when the tree fell. However, the Sima family still sent more than 30 men of sacrifice, whose clothes were still wet from blood to swords, to protect a similar number of women, children, and the elderly. It seemed that this was the last bit of the Sima family's spirit left. Obviously, they really regarded Su Fengnian, who was sitting on the bench under the thatched cottage, as a life-saving amulet. After the 6-jewel bodhisattva came and went like a ghost, the Sima family's spirit rose a little. After all, in the western region, it was not a bad thing to have a connection with Lantua Mountain. Su Fengnian, who had nothing to do, looked at the people 200 steps away. They were also looking at him, a strange guest of unknown origin. Among them, the eyes of the children were wide open. They were all holding weapons. Whether it was the weapons or the tragic situation tonight, it was too heavy for them. Many children still had tears on their faces. There were slightly tall boys comforting the little girls beside them. There were also adult men with crossbows who were bandaging their wounds with the help of the women. There were also nimble children who picked up arrows from somewhere and tiptoed carefully to put them into their elders' quiver. In order to prevent the Dong family's assassins from assassinating under the cover of the night, lanterns were hung on the branches of the trees. The lights were unusually bright. In the night breeze, Su Fengnian looked at them. The children were also staring blankly at this powerful figure who could make friends with the Bodhisattva of Lantua Mountain. Then, under the escort of several experts from the inner city who were more skilled than the retainers of ordinary families, a woman with a huge ox-horned bow on her back walked towards Su Fengnian. Her graceful figure, slender waist, long legs, and the huge killing weapon were particularly eye-catching in the light. Su Fengnian slowly got up, thinking that he was helping the monk who called himself the senior brother of the monk of the dragon tree to entertain the guests. However, he obviously underestimated his momentum. When he bent down and got up, except for the woman, the other 3 experts suddenly froze. Then, when they found that the mistress was still moving forward, they gripped their weapons tightly and followed her. Before Su Fengnian stood up, he found that the group of people were so nervous, so he sat back down, thinking that this would probably make them feel more at ease. However, he did not expect that his rise and fall would completely irritate the group of frightened birds. They whistled and shouted. Without saying anything, a relatively young man stood in front of the mistress and pointed his saber at her. He stared at Su Fengnian, as if he was going to fight to the death. Su Fengnian felt a little helpless. "Do you want me to stand or sit?" The woman whispered to the experts beside her, who were trained by her family for thousands of days, and then asked them to stay 50 steps away. She walked in front of Su Fengnian alone and smiled as she pointed at the bench where the 6-jewel bodhisattva sat. Su Fengnian nodded. She took off the ox-horned bow and sat down. She smiled and said, "Young master, please don't mind. Our Sima family is really jittery tonight. Oh, I forgot to ask you, can you understand me?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "I'm not from Beimang. Of course I can understand Madame Chai's Central Plains official language." Not only this city, but the entire western region knew that the head of the Sima family was Madame Chai. After marrying into the Sima family, no woman took her husband's surname. She had been in charge of the family for 20 years, so some of the 3 families in the inner city called the Sima family the Chai family. Su Fengnian had gathered intelligence in the whispering room and learned that Madame Chai was a refugee from Dongyue. She was forced to migrate to this place, and the elders in her family quickly withered away. She was alone and pitifully married into the Sima family, which was still struggling in the outer city. It could be said that she had personally managed the Sima family to its current status. As for the hardships she had gone through, Su Fengnian did not know about them, nor did he have any interest in them. She said bluntly, "Since young master is not a Beimang barbarian, then I'll be frank with you. If I offend you in any way, please don't be angry. As long as young master can protect the 124 members of the Sima family, no matter what young master wants, as long as I can afford it, I'll give it to you." Su Fengnian did not say anything. This madam, who was almost 40 years old but was still more charming than a young woman, had a determined look in her eyes. "Perhaps young master feels that the Sima family is not worth mentioning, but I can guarantee that as long as we survive this crisis, as long as the Sima family's golden name is not completely destroyed tonight, then I'll be able to gather 2,000 people again in less than half a year." Then she suddenly felt a little miserable. That young man was actually looking into the distance in a daze at this critical moment that concerned the survival of her family. For her to be able to lead her family to this day, she naturally had her own perseverance. She said in a more serious tone, "Maybe young master is a man from the Central Plains who happened to pass by the western regions, or maybe you are a first-rate talent from the most prominent sect in the Liang River Lake. You have the ambition to reach the peak of martial arts, and you don't care about the glory and disgrace of one or two families in the western regions. However, I sincerely ask young master to help us this time. The Sima family will definitely be grateful to young master. In the future, as long as young master sends a message back to the western regions, even if it is the southern Jianghu, the Liao kingdom, or the Liang capital, if I am still alive, I will personally lead my family's elite forces to young master. Even if I am already dead, the next head of the Sima family will definitely not refuse to help young master. If I, Chai Dongdi, violate my oath, then I'll never be able to be a human again. Su Fengnian turned to look at this woman, his eyes in a trance. Her eyes instantly became cold, and her tone also became colder. I've said it before. As long as I can afford it, young master can take it away. In her life, she had seen too many men show this kind of expression in front of her. In the early years, it was the influential people in the outer city, and later, it was the ambitious people in the inner city, such as Dong Tiling of the Dong family, the father and sons of the Li family, and those men who were arrogant because they were masters on the ranking list. She said expressionlessly, but I'll only give young master what he wants once. She was no longer the ignorant girl who thought that there were chivalrous people everywhere in Jianghu. For so many years, for the sake of this family, she followed the rules of the western region and did many things that went beyond the bottom line of morality. She was cruel, bloody, dirty, scheming, and trapping. But for herself, there was one thing that she had always kept to her bottom line. She originally thought that in a few years, or at most 10 years, the western region would no longer talk about her appearance as Madame Chai, and there would no longer be any young people who would drool over her figure. Then, she would be able to live up to the memory of her husband, who only had a surname left. Su Fengnian did not become angry because of the misunderstanding. He only smiled. Madame Chai is thinking too much. It's just that you reminded me of a very important person. He turned to look in the northeast direction and said softly, I miss her very much. In fact, I've always missed her. She was stunned on the spot as she looked at the side of his face that was filled with warmth. She could see that this man's longing at this moment could not be faked. She suddenly felt sad and self-deprecating for no reason. The things that appeared on his face were the most extravagant things in the western region. She, a woman who had rebuked the winds and clouds of the western region for 20 years, had never felt this way before. Su Fengnian retracted his gaze and smiled. The person I'm waiting for hasn't arrived yet, so I do have some time left. Instead of sitting here in a daze, I might as well make a deal with you. Even someone as calm as her could not help but reveal a pleasantly surprised expression. However, the young man's next words made her feel as if she had been struck by lightning. Madame Chai, is there really only one time? Can we talk about it again? Whether it was her imposing manner, her arrogance, or her temperament, they were all exhausted at the first spurt of energy. Although Madame Chai was still angry this time, she was no longer as solemn and stirring as before. On the contrary, it was probably because she was too old, so even if she was angry, she still had a different kind of charm. At this moment, she seemed a little shy. Su Fengnian laughed heartily and waved his hand. All right, let's stop joking. It's just that I felt that your heartstrings were too tense earlier and that this kind of injury was actually endless. Madam, you're an expert in using the bow, so you should know the principle of relaxation. Let's talk about business. To tell you the truth, I have some secret operations in the inner city. In the last half a year, I've established a power in the inner city. Madam, you might have already met that sour old scholar. He's one of my men in the western region. Madame Chai's expression became serious. Most women in the world were like this. After the pleasant surprise, she could not help but fuss over every little thing. She softly asked, I heard that the old man's surnamed Lu either has a background in Biyao, or he's an expert from the god of fortune's Li family, one in the open and one in the dark. In fact, they're both from Liang and Jianghu. Chapter 1457. Su Fengnian shook his head. That's not important. I can guarantee that the Sima family will continue to be one of the great families in the inner city. As long as you work with that old scholar, not only will you be able to struggle at death's door under the Dong family's nose, but you will also be able to squeeze out the Dong family. If you want people, I can give you people that are not inferior to those on the inner city's expert list. As long as you dare to ask, I can give you a lot. If you want armor, crossbows, spears, I can give them all to you. As for my request, it's very simple. The Sima family must have a cavalry of no less than 5,000 people in this city. When they are willing to put their heads on their belts to fight for riches and honor, when there is hope for riches and honor, you must make them believe that your words are not empty words. Su Fengnian paused for a long time. Whether or not I will be able to see these things in the future, Madam Chai, you can rest assured. When you find that old scholar surnamed Lu, you can tell him that I told you that his name is Lu Wenbao, Shimawei Post House, Old Locust Tree. He will naturally believe you and will do his best to cooperate with you in the future. However, I will also say the ugly words first. If you and the Sima family don't keep your promise and become cowards when it's time for you to fight for your lives, or if someone comes to you in the future to give you more benefits, then please remember that whatever I can give to the Sima family tonight, I will take it back in double whether or not I appear in the future. Your western regions are messing around in this small piece of land. What inner city, what outer city, what experts, what three great families, there will be a day when you will understand that they are really nothing. Madam Chai smiled sweetly and nodded. That's right. In the eyes of the great king of Biyao, other than Beimang's million-strong army, there is nothing else important. Other than the emperor of Liyang and the empress of Beimang, there is no one else important, right? Su Fengnian was surprised. You guessed it. She was silent for a moment, then smiled. I was just making things up. Your Highness must only be so easily tricked in front of insignificant women, right? Su Fengnian didn't deny anything. He couldn't help but laugh. It's not good to hold grudges. It was Madam Chai's turn to be stunned. Are you really the king of Biyao? Su Fengnian joked back, what? You're too easy to talk to. You don't look like a border king with authority. Or is it that he can sit on a small stool and chat with Madam for half a day? No matter how I look at him, he doesn't look like an expert. Madam Chai blinked her eyes. Didn't they say that His Highness is extremely handsome? There are quite a few well-informed young girls in the inner city who are extremely curious about the prince. There are also a few in our Sima family who used to practice the sword, but when they heard that the prince started out by practicing the saber, they foolishly went to practice the saber. I've been nagging about His Highness's name all day. Even my ears are about to grow calluses. Su Fengnian was speechless. He stretched out a finger and tapped the space between his eyebrows. He smiled bitterly. Women. Madam Chai looked at the distant family members who had survived the turmoil and calmly said, there's a girl called Sima Bisui. She vowed that she would go to Biyao to find that guy called Su Fengnian if she could one day master a peerless saber technique. Even if she couldn't become his wife, she could become his confidant. Many people made fun of her, but she didn't have any talent. She just buried herself in practicing the saber. Su Fengnian softly said, and then she died. She nodded and said in a calm voice, that's right. She couldn't kill anyone and didn't want to be humiliated, so she killed herself with a saber. She stabbed her abdomen and didn't lightly slit her neck. If she had died in the latter way, those men wouldn't have let her off. In our western regions, such simple fools, especially women, don't live long. Even if they're lucky enough to survive, they won't live happily. Su Fengnian followed her line of sight and looked at the group of people who were laughing and talking without worry. He sighed with emotion. There'll be a day when the world will be peaceful. When that time comes, your western regions will also be filled with the sound of books. Children won't be thinking about how to survive every day. Instead, they'll be thinking about how to study hard and obtain scholarly honors. In the future, there'll also be willow trees and men and women who will meet at dusk. Young people will do what they should have done when they were young. In the future, there'll be rattan chairs for old people to lie on and bask in the sun. They'll slowly recall the heroic deeds they were proud of and the things they regretted. When their lives come to an end, they'll be able to peacefully pass on their unfulfilled wishes to their children and grandchildren. Madame Chai gently shook her head with a smile. It was as if she couldn't believe that the soil under her feet was soaked with blood and that such a beautiful scene of paradise would one day appear. However, she subconsciously reached out to stroke a strand of messy black hair and gently tucked it behind her ear. However, she suddenly straightened her body and tightly gripped the horn bough by her feet. In front of her sharp eyes, there seemed to be traces of ripples as thin as strands of hair. In the distance, there was a muffled and oppressive sound. The three experts in the inner city looked around in panic. In the end, they could only see the scene closest to them. It was a large tree with dense branches and leaves. A corpse wearing tight black clothes fell from the tree. It must be known that there were 3 large lanterns hanging on the tree. It was obvious that the people in the Sima family didn't find any trace of this person from beginning to end. However, what really made the 3 experts in the inner city feel their hands and feet go cold was that they simply couldn't see the young man sitting on the small bench. He looked harmless and gentle, but when he killed people, he didn't leave a trace. A great master. He was definitely a great master that even the top 3 experts in the inner city, Dong Tiling, paled in comparison. Because Madame Chai was close to the water, and because she was an expert in the inner city who was ranked just below Dong Tiling, she could barely see the mysterious ripples. She roughly knew that in the Liyang River Lake, the martial man realm was divided into 9 levels. The second level was considered to be a great master in the Central Plains. She barely stood on the threshold of the second level and saw a bit of the spectacular scene in the inner city. She used to think that if she could put down her family's affairs and focus on martial arts, then it would be easy for her to become one of the top 3 experts in the inner city. She might even be able to compete with the legendary first-level experts in the Liyang River Lake. As for the previous 10 people in the martial arts evaluation and the recent 14 people in the martial arts evaluation and the 4 great masters, she didn't have any idea what they were. She only knew that they were very strong. It was like looking at a mountain from afar. You know that the mountain peak was very high, but you can't imagine how high it was until you get close. Then, the young man beside her, whose identity she was still doubtful about, opened the door to the first level for her in a slightly stingy and obscure way. Then, she suddenly realized that in the eyes of the small group of true martial arts masters, the first-level experts who considered themselves to be extraordinary, were no different from ants. Then, even the children of the Sima family could see a strange scene. From the shadows in the distance, a ghostly figure suddenly appeared, running as fast as thunder with an aggressive aura. They thought that it was an expert from the Dong family who came to kill people in broad daylight, and that it might even be the infamous Dong Tiling himself. But soon, everyone was confused. The expert with a very strong figure did not seem to be here to cause trouble, but was pushed here by someone. He seemed to be avoiding something invisible, except for the period when he was constantly approaching the thatched cottage. At the same time, his footsteps were disorderly, and he flapped around in all directions. He was in a very sorry state. Obviously, no one was fighting with him, but he made a few dazzling front, back, and side somersaults. In short, there were all kinds of somersaults. He was originally a very strong expert, but in the end, he was reduced to a sideshow in the eyes of the children of the Sima family. When he was about 30 steps away from the thatched cottage, he finally stopped to catch his breath. At this time, Madame Chai finally saw the old man. He was actually the god of wealthy families' most honorable consecrator. At this time, his clothes were ragged, as if they had been cut into pieces bit by a sharp weapon, dripping with blood. He glared at the young man sitting on the stool and said in a hoarse voice, "Dong Tai's nurturing sword and controlling sword, I finally know who you are." Su Fengnian looked at Zhao Go, one of the founding members of Liyang. "The only reason you're still alive is because you had a colleague in Azure City." Before he died, he said a few words, which was equivalent to him dying in your place. "You can go now, but remember to tell Li Fengmao not to compete with the Sima family in the future. As for your plans in the western regions, they have been following the rules these past few years, so I can pretend that I didn't see them." The thin elder roared and rushed forward, causing the dust under his feet to fly up. The tip of his foot created a hole in the ground, but the elder quickly stopped. Madame Chai squinted her eyes and saw a flying sword that was less than an inch long, hovering in front of the elder's forehead. The sword's body was dark green, sparkling and translucent. It was a beautiful little sword that could make people feel happy. Madame Chai's lips curled up slightly as she thought of a certain person's sigh. Women. The old man, who could cover the sky with one hand in this city, glanced at the young man who was mostly covered in skin. He snorted coldly and retreated. He leaped onto a branch and quickly disappeared into the ink-black night. Su Fengnian's mind moved, and he put away the flying swords into his sleeve. He then pointed at the 30-years-old man who had pulled out his sword and asked with a smile, "What's his name? How long has it been since he joined the Sima family?" Madame Chai's mind was very sharp, and immediately a haze appeared in her heart. She looked sadly at the man who she had high hopes for. He's the youngest person on the inner city's expert list. He's known as an assassin who's better than the Dong family's assassins. He's been working for the Sima family since his father's generation. It's probably because a man's heart is not content, or because he doesn't want his descendants to be someone else's servant. Madame Chai, who was sitting on the stool with Su Fengnian, said coldly, "Isn't that right, Tao Disong?" Chapter 1458. The dignified man pursed his lips. He didn't refute or admit anything. He just stared at Madame Chai. Of course, Su Fengnian just watched from the side. Previously, when Tao Disong saw him stand up, his killing intent was still within reason, and could be understood as him wanting to protect his master. But after seeing the Dong family assassin fall from the tree, the killing intent of a martial artist in a dangerous situation was not something that could be explained by a loyal servant of the Sima family. Su Fengnian sighed. He lowered his head and rubbed his cheeks. He felt a little bitter. The Wutongan county had been living in harmony for so many years. How could the Sima family in the western regions be so unpredictable? Tao Disong didn't reveal his true intentions. He just looked at Madame Chai, who was 8 years older than him. Madame Chai seemed to realize the truth. She was furious. She scolded, "When did the Sima family ever stop you from being a superior person? They have spent so much effort to cultivate you. Are you heartless and unscrupulous? In the western regions, there is no benevolence, no righteousness, and no loyalty. But don't forget that everyone in the western regions believes in the word trust. No matter how evil you are, as long as you promise something, you will keep your promise. Even the children in the city know this." Tao Disong's face was wooden. "Madam, I have respected you since I was young. I have treated you like a female bodhisattva." Madame Chai said angrily, "Shut up." She suddenly stood up and grabbed the ox horn bow. In an instant, the bow was drawn to the shape of a full moon. It was clear that her martial arts cultivation was indeed one of the best in the city. Tao Disong didn't care about that huge bow at all. He didn't care about that sharp iron arrow that was ready to be shot out. He only looked at Madame Chai and murmured, "When I became sensible, especially when I found out that I was more talented in martial arts than all the men in the family, I told myself that one day, I would make Madame Chai's life less tiring." Su Fengnian muttered under his breath, "You're trying to say that you won't be so lonely, right?" He emphasized the word lonely. When Madame Chai heard this, she was so angry that she almost turned around and shot this guy to death. Tao Disong looked up to the sky and laughed. He laughed until tears came out of his eyes. He raised his arm and wiped his eyes. He looked at Madame Chai's face and his eyes began to emit a man's unique passion. "Madam, why do you have to live such a tiring life? In 5 years, I will be in the top 3 of the inner city's top 3. In 10 years, I, Tao Disong, will be the #1 expert in the inner city. 5 years later, I will be 35 years and you will be 43. You won't be old. And you will look like a woman in her youth. You are the most beautiful woman in the world. Even if you 10 years later, you will be old madam, you, the most beautiful woman. Even if you in 10 years, you. Ins, s, in, s. Inzazazaz. Madame Chai was going to shoot an arrow at Tao Disong's face when he moved. Although she wasn't sure if she would succeed, she definitely wouldn't let this ingrate continue talking. However, there was a guy beside her who interrupted her. He said that if Tao Disong told her what was on his mind, he would completely give up. Madame Chai would have a clear conscience after killing her own family. However, she soon regretted it. This Tao Disong, who had been respectful to her like a junior for many years, was actually dead. In her memory, he was still living a bright life in the western region. Therefore, she didn't hesitate to shoot that arrow. Tao Disong finally revealed the true face he had hidden for many years. He rushed forward and tilted his body to the right. After dodging the arrow, he continued to rush toward the thatched cottage. He laughed sinisterly and said, "Madam, since I can't have you while I'm alive, let's go to the Yellow Springs together. Before we reach the gates of hell, Tao Disong, will," without giving Tao Disong a chance to say another word, his neck was pierced through by a powerful eagle feather arrow. His entire body was sent flying backwards by the great force of the arrow, smashing heavily on the ground with his back. Perhaps this was the western region. The winner takes all, and the loser takes all. It was always so fast. It wasn't at all like the Jianghu feuds in the Central Plains. They had to use all kinds of schemes to get to the bottom of the matter. Su Fengnian's eyes were calm. He said in a low voice, "I remember there was a man called Lu Qiantang. When he was about to die, he was much more manly than you. He was the real Jianghu man." Tao Disong died with his eyes wide open, because he knew that his wife, who had fought side by side with him not long ago, had not been seriously injured in the fight with the top assassins of the Dong family, but her chi was in a mess, and it was impossible for her to kill him within 10 arrows. Of course, he knew that with the help of that strange man, he could not kill his wife, but in the end, he could not even die a slower death in his wife's hands, because his throat was pierced by that man's flying sword before the eagle feather arrow. This ambitious man only had one thought in his mind before he died. "Madam Chai, I really like you." But the other expert of the Sima family, who was more loyal and devoted than him, strode towards Tao Disong's body. With one kick, he was sent flying more than 10 feet away. His body rolled on the ground. Thus, no one knew about the 2 lines of tears on his face before he died. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Madam, you can go about your business. Anyway, we have already finalized the deal. You still have a mess to clean up. You don't have to pay attention to me." However, Madame Chai unexpectedly sat back down on the stool. The stool was small, and in order to deal with tonight's assassination, she had quickly changed into a set of night clothes, which made her but look like a full moon. Su Fengnian didn't remind her. Maybe she didn't realize it, or maybe she didn't care. Or maybe she just didn't want to squint at him. She had some unspeakable, boring, competitive spirit. A woman's heart was like a needle at the bottom of the sea. She looked at the family that was still orderly despite the chaos. She said softly, "If you want to be busy, it's easy. There will always be things that you can't finish. I have been busy for over 20 years. At first, I was nervous and flustered. Later on, I became confident and familiar with the way things were. But after all, I have always been busy. Even in my dreams, I was thinking about how to expand the family business. Today, I finally have the chance to take a break." Su Fengnian smiled indifferently, "My luck is better than yours. I have only started to be busy these few years. Even if I don't make the decision for my family, no matter how difficult the situation is, we will not panic." Su Fengnian suddenly turned his head and said helplessly, "Madam Chai, do you really not understand that I am asking you to leave, or are you pretending not to understand? You are taking a break from your busy schedule, but I also want to sit here alone and quietly stare blankly." She made an "oh" sound and didn't say anything else. She also didn't have any intention of getting up. Su Fengnian dismissed it with a smile. She suddenly shouted out a name and waved her hand in the distance. Soon, a 13 or 14-year-old girl ran over timidly. She was a complete beauty and bore a 70 to 80% resemblance to Madame Chai. However, the resemblance was only 40 to 50%. After all, Madame Chai's current temperament had been honed through countless hardships. The girl had grown up under the protection of her warm wings, so the only thing that resembled her was her natural appearance. The girl, who had 2 splendid sabers hanging from her waist, squatted beside Madame Chai. She didn't dare to look at Su Fengnian. Madame Chai stroked the girl's head. Tai He is my daughter. I heard people say that the most powerful experts in the Central Plains either don't use weapons or use swords. She only started practicing sabers at the end of last year and only found this pair of sabers after rummaging through the weapons storage at home. Tai He, look, this young master is the one you're looking for. Didn't you quarrel with your best friend over who should be the wife of that person before the new year? Now, you've taken the initiative earlier than that stupid girl from the Li family. Let me tell you, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If you miss this village, there won't be this shop again. The young girl suddenly raised her head and widened her eyes. Him? Madame Chai nodded with a smile. She glanced at the young man who was laughing involuntarily from the corner of her eyes. There was a hint of schadenfreude hidden in her eyes. The girl suddenly turned her head and instantly turned back. Her face was full of resentment and suspicion. You don't look like him at all. Su Fengnian smiled bitterly. He thought to himself, could this time Madai's face be similar to mine? However, it's best if they don't look like each other. Do I really have to deal with this stupid girl from the western region and have a conversation with her that says, you are Su Fengnian, yes, really, and, of course it's real. Su Fengnian felt his scalp go numb when he thought of this. At the same time, he couldn't help but laugh. Old Manly, with your arrogant personality when you were young, you must have been even more annoyed than me back then, right? Madame Chai added fuel to the fire and whispered, silly girl, it's really him. He's wearing a fake face. Otherwise, do you think that person would swagger into the western region? Do you think I'm lying to you? Su Fengnian covered his forehead with his hand. No one would have thought that this girl would cry out without any warning. If it weren't for Madame Chai gently covering the girl's mouth, she would have wailed without restraint. She stopped crying with great difficulty and turned her head again. She looked at Su Fengnian seriously and sobbed, Big Sister Bisui really liked you. The naive girl quickly added in a sobbing tone, Big Sister Bisui also liked you a lot, but she died today. Can you help me write a few words? When I visit her grave in the future, I'll burn it for her, okay? Madame Chai sighed softly. There was a pleading look in her eyes. Su Fengnian smiled and said, but we don't have a pen and ink right now. Then, the seemingly weak girl cut off a piece of her sleeve and handed it to Su Fengnian. She then asked him to extend his hand. Finally, she used her right hand to cut open a large wound on her left palm. Blood flowed onto Su Fengnian's palm. Chapter 1459. Madame Chai didn't hide the pride on her face. My daughter's temperament is naturally like mine. She won't lose to the fiercest man in the western regions. Su Fengnian raised his arm and blood flowed down his fingertips. He wrote the name, Sima Bisui, on the sleeve. The young girl hurriedly said, add your name too. He had no choice but to add the 3 words Su Fengnian. The young girl treasured the sleeve that only had 2 names written on it. Looking at the bloody words, she couldn't help but sob. However, she quickly wiped her tears with her arm and pitifully looked at Su Fengnian. Why don't you write one for me too? Without waiting for Su Fengnian to speak, she began to cut her clothes in one breath. Then, she made a cut on her other hand. Su Fengnian hurriedly stopped her. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All right. I'm afraid of you. Just give me the sleeve. Su Fengnian took the sleeve. His right index finger gently poked the pad of his left middle finger. He wrote, Su Fengnian, Sima Tieha, on the sleeve. The young girl stretched her neck and stared at the sleeve. She softly said, in between the 2 names, add the word gift. Su Fengnian added another word. With the 2 sleeves in her hands, the young girl was satisfied. She carefully put away the sleeve book and solemnly thanked Su Fengnian. Only then did she stand up and leave. With her back to him and her mother, she secretly sobbed as she walked far away. Su Fengnian smiled. Madam Chai, you have a good daughter. Madam Chai nodded. Who said otherwise? My only wish in this life is to not let her live like me. Originally, this wish was almost shattered. Fortunately, Prince appeared here today. She finally stood up. The corners of her mouth held a happy smile. I won't disturb Prince's peaceful cultivation. Su Fengnian raised his head and said, Live well. In her entire life, Madam Chai had never treated a man with such sincerity. Su Fengnian closed his eyes. You must live well in Dunhuang, you must wait for me. In the next 6 hours, the Sima clan had already begun to disperse under Madam Chai's orders. In the meantime, she and her daughter had stood side by side and looked at Su Fengnian, who was sitting under the eaves with his eyes closed, from afar. When the cottage returned to silence, Su Fengnian opened his eyes. As expected, the 6-jewel bodhisattva did not return with the sword and saber from Mount Lantua. In that case, they could only make do with it for now. In the upcoming battle, it wasn't up to anyone to decide who was magnanimous or extravagant. They had to haggle over every detail. The key was to see who could last until the end. Su Fengnian tore off his face and slowly stood up. His 2 big sleeves fluttered in the wind. In the light, he looked like an immortal who was free and unfettered in the mortal world. Su Fengnian raised an arm. The whole city was filled with swords. Long swords, short swords, ancient swords, new swords, all of them flew over and chirped cheerfully. In the straight line in front of him, the swords were connected head to tail. They were arranged in a row and hovered in the air. There was once an old man who dripped water on a path in the rain to form a sword. Su Fengnian smiled. The wind was strong. This time, there was no need to talk. Su Fengnian's arm gently pushed forward and then began to move forward. The swords connected and finally converged into a long sword that was hundreds of feet long. Su Fengnian said in a low voice, Let's go. This sword, in an instant, broke out of the city. It crashed into the Beimang military god, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was rushing toward the city. Dunhuang City. In the middle of the night, there was a woman who was a light sleeper. When her child cried, she quickly put on her clothes and gently picked up the child from the cradle. The child's tears quickly turned into laughter. She lowered her head and looked at the childish smiling face. She also smiled. She gently swayed her arm and slowly hummed, little sweet potato, grow up quickly. Zhao Bing, the king of Yanqi, had an army of no more than 100,000 soldiers under his command, but he actually had more than 200,000 soldiers and horses under his command. Among them, the infantry generals Zhang Dingyuan and Gu Ying, one was adept at playing to his strengths and avoiding his weaknesses, and using his advantage to attack his weakness, and the other was adept at surprise attacks, and loved to fight to the death. There was also Yuanzhou General Yi Xiufeng, known as Nanjiang King Mingyang. He was good at defending the city and was famous in the south. Hezhou General Liang Yu was good at surprise attacks. He used infantry as cavalry. All of these people were talented and difficult to tame generals. However, their limelight and sharpness had always been covered by the Beiliang cavalry. The number of times these people were mentioned in the capital of Liang might not be as many as Chu Lushan or Yan Wenhuan. However, there was one exception, and that was Nanjiang's number 1 general, Wu Zhongshuan. This old general not only commanded half of the soldiers and horses in the north of Nanjiang, but he also had the only cavalry in Nanjiang. At that time, His Royal Highness Zhao Zhu led thousands of cavalry to Guangling to help the king quell the rebellion. To be precise, he borrowed part of the soldiers and horses from Wu Zhongshuan. Wu Zhongshuan and Nailan Yusi became Zhao Bing's left and right arms. However, compared to Nailan Yusi, who was almost blindly trusted by the king of Yanqi, Wu Zhongshuan, who commanded the troops outside, paled in comparison. Among his 3 sons, the eldest and youngest were left in the territory under the jurisdiction of the king of Yanqi. Only one son, born of a concubine, followed by this old man. He also did not join the army. He ate, drank, whored, and gambled, and was the leader of the northern part of Nanjiang. It was rumored that once he took advantage of the opportunity when his father was patrolling the northern border to sneak into the south with more than 100 elite private retainers to show off. In the end, he was beaten to a pulp by His Royal Highness. That was not all. After he was beaten silly, no one knew who came up with the bad idea, but he actually went to the king's mansion to make a scene. After everything calmed down, outsiders did not know the inside story. Nanjiang only knew that the king of Yan Qi's third son, Zhao Yu, who held an important position in the army in the north, was recalled to the south. In any case, since then, Wu Zhongshuan rarely returned to the south. He wholeheartedly guarded the northern part of Nanjiang. A group of more than 20 riders stopped their horses and raised their whips on the south bank of Guangling River. They looked at the rolling river flowing east, like the most spectacular white silk in the world undulating with the wind. There was a large age gap between these riders, but they were all wearing armor and carrying swords. Their vigorous spirit was extremely eye-catching. The few riders in the middle had a kind of vigorous spirit condensed from being in a superior position for a long time. The white-haired old man with a straight back was the most eye-catching. The old man held the whip made of tiger bone and the whip made of tiger skin. He narrowed his eyes and looked across the river, straight to the north bank. The two middle-aged generals beside the old man were his trusted subordinates that he had cultivated for 20 to 30 years. Tang He and Li Chunyu's reputation was slightly inferior to Zhang Dingyuan, Gu Ying, and the others. However, if they really competed on the battlefield, the old man did not think that they would lose. Furthermore, Tang He and Li Chunyu were both born in the top noble families in the north of Nanjiang. They had a complicated marriage alliance. This meant that the old man had more connections in the central plains than the king of Yan, who was severely restricted by the laws of the vassal states. Tang He was a coarse-looking man. His face was full of sideburns, and he did not have the time or thought to take care of them. A few strands of his beard were tangled together. He bent down and touched the muscular back of his warhorse. He complained, "Did the two vassals, Zhao Yi and Zhao Sun, come to an agreement beforehand? Why are they so arrogant? They are not willing to help us cross the river, using the excuse that they want to defeat Chao Changqing's navy to ensure our safety." The old man was the #1 general of Nanjiang, Wu Zhongshuan. He said calmly, "This logic makes sense. 100,000 soldiers crossing the river is not a small matter." Tang He said carelessly, "Chao Changqing has made it clear that he has shrunk the battle line and concentrated his troops at Bailu Lake. Then we can go to Longmen Ferry and have the Qingzhou Navy protect us. Does the Zhao Yi Navy lack these 10 days to half a month? Otherwise, we can cross the river from the estuary of Guangling. Chao Changqing's warships can't climb onto the shore, go around the Zhao Yi Navy, and then jump into the river to stop us, right? These bastards just don't want to see our Nanjiang elite troops successfully cross the river." Wu Zhongshuan shook his head and said, "This is the intention of the capital. Do you think Zhao Yi and Zhao Sun can make the decision?" Tang He's face was full of sarcasm. He laughed out loud and said, "For a vassal to act like this, you can be considered capable." Wu Zhongshuan had always had a cold personality. He had spent most of his life in the military. No matter if it was a great victory or a crushing defeat, he had always had an attitude that showed neither sorrow nor joy. He had become the perfect example of the saying in military books, "A person with a thunderous heart but a face as calm as a lake can be worshipped as a general." Wu Zhongshuan sank into deep thought. Compared to the generals around him who were mostly brave on the battlefield but not familiar with the court, as a general, the old man's thoughts were more complicated. This time, he was leading his troops north. Was it not a huge gamble? Other than official business, the old man also had a private matter to attend to. Someone wanted him to take care of a young man in Wu city called Jianghu. In exchange, that person promised him that not only would he become the main general of the Nanjiang army on the northern expedition, after crossing Guangling, there would be a great wealth waiting for him. Wu Zhongshuan had no chance to refuse this matter because that person had exposed the mastermind behind Wu Zhongshuan's rise to fame, Huang Sanjia. Regarding this secret, not to mention his 3 disappointing sons, Wu Zhongshuan didn't even tell his wife, who had grown old with him, about it. At this time, another group of cavalry galloped over. Tang He, Li Chunyu, and the others raised their eyes to look. Their expressions were somewhat strange. Wu Zhongshuan squeezed the horse's belly and urged it forward. On the horse's back, he lightly cupped his fist to the heroic young man. This general greets His Royal Highness. Chapter 1460. This young man, who only had 5 or 6 retainers with him, was the crown prince of Yanqi, Zhao Zhu. Compared to Wu Zhongshuan and his men, who were clad in metal armor, Zhao Zhu was dressed in a brocade robe. If it were not for the common saber on his waist, he would be easily mistaken for a young master who was out traveling. Beside him were 2 personal bodyguards from the crown prince's mansion, as well as a few outsiders from the southern border, 1 man and 2 women. The man's attire was extremely strange. He had a monk's ring scar on his bald head, but he wore a Taoist robe. The slightly older woman was extremely beautiful. She looked like a beautiful woman in her early 30s. If it wasn't for the fact that her aura was extremely strong and intimidating, she would have died young in this chaotic world of war and on the banks of the Guangling River, where the smoke of war was rising from all directions. The younger woman was tall and was clearly a woman from the northern lands. Her appearance was not that stunning, but she had a unique style. Tang He, Li Chunyu, and the other generals had long heard of the half-monk, half-Taoist man and the woman who had appeared on the Rouge list 3 times. Gong Bonk, the disciple of Wang Xinji of the Martial Emperor City, and Linya, the great grandmaster of fist arts, were well-known figures in Jianghu. As for why these 2 people had attached themselves to His Royal Highness, they were too lazy to think about it. No matter what conflict Crown Prince Zhao Zhu had with their benefactor, Wu Zhongshuan, the vast southern border would be filled with heartfelt admiration. His Royal Highness had joined the army at a young age and had killed almost 10 people in the land of the Berserk miasma. He had built countless fortresses of various sizes. Before the rise of the young man surnamed Su in Bailiang, the people of the southern border were incomparably proud. They liked to say to outsiders that they had produced the crown prince of the crown prince who was most proficient in both the pen and the sword. Zhao Zhu smiled brightly and returned a fist salute. "Thank you for your hard work, General." Wu Zhongshuan's mouth twitched. This was probably considered a smile. Zhao Zhu turned his head to look at the river and asked softly, "What is the movement between Zhao Sun and Zhao Yi?" Zhao Zhu was, after all, the commander-in-chief of the northern expedition in name. Wu Zhongshuan was only the deputy commander-in-chief, assisting His Royal Highness, who had disappointed Li Yang greatly. Wu Zhongshuan said in a low voice, "The Qingzhou Navy went east along the river. At the Wubo Lake Pass, Longdu, and the west of Bailu Lake Zhuji, to block the return route. Furthermore, the Qingzhou Navy's division of the Navy is Zhao Sun. Qingzhou is definitely an expert who is guiding Zhao. As for Zhao Yi's half of the Guangling Navy, on the vast Bailu Lake, the large warships are more powerful. Now that the ships are in formation, they are like cavalry on land. Chao Chengqing's West Chu Navy has few soldiers and small ships to begin with. Encountering such a formation, not only is it difficult to attack from the front and difficult to attack from the back, even their original advantage of being small and nimble has disappeared." Zhao Zhu nodded and seemed to ask casually, "In the late spring, what is the weather like at Bailu Lake? What is the wind direction?" Wu Zhongshuan was stunned. Not only was this old general who had never personally participated in a large naval battle, the other generals were also stumped. Linya, the female Wudao grandmaster who once carried a cauldron to smash the slow-moving sword that entered the city at Suaxia Valley, smiled and said, "The strategists of the Spring Snow House who have been living by the Guangling River all year round aren't all good for nothings." Zhao Zhu sighed and said, "Then now it all depends on whether Chao Chengqing can turn the tide with his strength alone." Gong Bonk rubbed his bald head. "It will be difficult. The best swordsman in the capital, Qi Jiajia, has arrived. Chai Qingshan of the Dongyue sword pool will also not be absent. It is said that the woman surnamed Xianyuan from Mount Hui will also help. In addition to Zhao Go, who has turned out in full force, killing Chao Chengqing is out of the question. But if we talk about blocking a few of them, it will not be difficult." Wu Zhongshuan's cavalry unit bid farewell and left. Zhao Zhu remained on the riverbank for a long time. He shook his head and lowered his head to look. The saber at his waist was tied with a thin string to a worn-out money pouch. His Royal Highness muttered to himself, "If there is a day when the country belongs to me, Zhao Zhu, and the Jianghu belongs to you, Su Fengnian, then it will not be in vain that we two brothers met at Dantong Pass." He reached out and grabbed the cloth pouch that he had sewn and mended many times. He gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, "The one surnamed Su, no matter what difficulties you encounter, don't die. You are the only brother I will recognize in my life. Don't try to be a hero. If worst comes to worst, you can come to my place. You have to know that the little beggar who was so poor that his pocket could not even make a sound is now richer than anyone else." The northern barbarians saw beautiful silk, but they did not believe that it was made from silk spun by insects. The scholars of the Central Plains did not believe that there were yurts in the grasslands that could accommodate 1,000 people. The people of the world did not go to Guangling River, but they did not believe that there were large boats on the river that could accommodate 20,000 people. In the middle of Bailu Lake, a majestic ship that was 30 to 40 feet above the water's surface sailed alone on the lake. Looking at the direction of the ship's bow, it was heading toward the West Chu Navy. A large flag with the character, Jiang, flapped in the wind. A beautiful woman with a purple sword case on her back stood on the railing of the third floor. Her clothes fluttered in the wind, making her look like a fairy. The surface of the lake was vast. Suddenly, a small boat appeared in the distance. It got closer and closer until it was a few hundred feet away from the ship. A woman in white sat at the bow of the boat. A red string was tied around her wrist and a wine pot was hanging. Behind her stood a person in a red robe with large sleeves. The woman with the sword on her back and the woman in white looked at each other at almost the same time. It was just a glance and they did not look at each other anymore. The world did not know that this meeting had been separated by a full 800 years. The woman in white Luo Yang retracted her gaze. She raised her head and drank a mouthful of wine. She smiled lazily and said, "After so many years, I still find it annoying." On the other side, Jiang and I reached out and pressed down on the sword case. Only then did the sword in the case stop crying. In the big city of the West regions that stood thousands of miles above the yellow sand. When the sword was about to leave the city, the short man with a wooden face and long arms like an ape no longer suppressed the shockingly abundant qi in his body. His body suddenly expanded, and only then did he return to his normal stature. The long sword rushed forward in a line. He reached out his palm and hit the tip of the first sword. He twisted his wrist. The thousands of flying swords in the line all flew in a circle. After the long sword that pierced through the thick city wall spun for a while, it blasted a hole as big as a basket on the city wall. In the next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was charging forward, slammed his palm on the city wall. The whole city was in an uproar as if there was an earthquake. The 160 swords that went out of the city to welcome the guest were all shattered inch by inch. The 70 swords that were still connected with qi in the city were also shattered by Tuoba Bodhisattva's palm. Walking on the lonely street in the city, Su Fengnian waved his sleeve. The long sword changed into a thunder whip that was used by immortals to suppress otherworldly items. Purple lightning lingered around the long whip. The long whip fiercely slashed on the inner city wall. The qi knife cut through the wall like tofu and shot toward Tuoba Bodhisattva. The #1 martial artist in Beimang, who rarely fought for many years, strode forward and directly broke through the city wall. After entering the city, he grabbed the upstanding qi that looked like a long whip but was actually the essence of the sword will and tore it apart. His other hand slapped out casually. The broken pieces of the city wall that didn't have time to fall to the ground disappeared in a flash. Su Fengnian put 2 fingers together and gently drew. The long whip with purple qi that didn't weaken at all quickly bent and retracted. It smashed the huge rock that broke through the air. Under the whip, a bottomless ravine was torn out on the street. In the next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva's left foot stepped on the tip of the sword. The whole sword began to shake. Su Fengnian whispered, "Disperse." The remaining 700 flying swords seemed to have understood human nature. They acted on their own and danced wildly. After the movement, there was silence. The 700 flying swords stopped in the air and formed a semicircular formation. The 700 flying swords pointed directly at Tuoba Bodhisattva on the ground. This stop was just a moment. The rain of swords fell rapidly. It was like a rainstorm falling from the sky. The violent crackling sounds were like raindrops the size of soybeans hitting the surface of an oil paper umbrella. Dust flew up on the street. Su Fengnian kicked Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest, telling him to leave the city from where he entered. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva rushed into the city again at a speed that was countless times faster than when he left the city. He punched Su Fengnian's right elbow that he raised to block. Then Su Fengnian's right fist and Tuoba Bodhisattva's left fist collided at the same time. Both of them only took 2 steps back. However, the tall buildings on their left and right had all collapsed. The streets near their feet were filled with swords that had fallen to the ground. Some were straight and some were slanted. After Tuoba Bodhisattva and Su Fengnian's fist collided again, they both took a step back and frowned. Because he realized that the 500 flying swords had sunk into the ground at the same time and disappeared. Ever since Su Fengnian started practicing Saber martial arts, he had traveled through 2 Jianghu. In these years, when he fought with his enemies to the death, he mostly borrowed other people's moves and rarely created his own moves. Today, Su Fengnian not only wanted to gamble on victory and defeat, he also wanted to use this opportunity to return to the peak of another realm at the same height. Previously, there was a sword in the world. After that, there was a sword on the ground. After Su Fengnian took 3 steps back, a rolling earth dragon formed by flying swords broke out of the ground and pounced on Tuoba Bodhisattva. His momentum was strong, his strength was great, and his chi was long. It was not something that the one-lined sword that had left the city could compare to. Tuoba Bodhisattva was actually forced out of the city. After this sword, Su Fengnian's state of mind also improved a little. He walked out of the city in a carefree manner. It was a pity that no one saw him. If the arrogant old man with the sheepskin fur coat was still alive, he would also cheer and applaud. If old Huang was still alive, he would definitely grin and give him a thumbs up with his missing front teeth. If some wanderer who had traveled the Jianghu with Su Fengnian with a wooden sword could also see this, he would most likely say some words of dissatisfaction, but in his heart, he would be happier than anyone else. Su Fengnian looked into the distance. It was as if he was looking at the Jianghu. This Jianghu where there was only him and was somewhat lonely. Chapter 1461. Tuoba Bodhisattva was knocked out of the city by the rolling sword of the earth dragon. Su Fengnian was also knocked out of the city and temporarily took the initiative. It was like a Liang Mang battle where Tuoba Bodhisattva attacked the city while Su Fengnian defended the city. In the end, Su Fengnian still forgot to bring 2 pots of wine. There were more than 1,000 swords in the city. After knocking Tuoba Bodhisattva out of the city again, there were only about 100 swords left. They formed 2 parallel circles around Su Fengnian like 2 snakes biting each other's tails. If Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted to get close to Su Fengnian, he would have to cross these 2 moats. After Tuoba Bodhisattva stood still, he was not in a hurry to get back at him. His gaze followed the 2 sword circles as he patted the dust off his chest. After a while, Tuoba Bodhisattva stepped forward. At the same time, the sword river that was as tall as Su Fengnian's waist expanded. However, Su Fengnian looked above his head. The second sword river that was at the same height as his chest tilted and blocked in front of Su Fengnian. The next moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva's figure appeared above Su Fengnian's head. He opened his 5 fingers and accurately grasped the key sword that was the eye of the formation in the torrent of sword aura. When the long river of sword formation was slightly stagnant, Tuoba Bodhisattva took the opportunity to stab down. Su Fengnian had one hand behind his back and the other hand in front of him gently shook his sleeve. More than 40 flying swords appeared on the sword bodies like red snakes that were as thin as needles. When Tuoba Bodhisattva broke through the formation and stabbed down with his sword, Su Fengnian gently moved 2 steps to the right and controlled more than 40 flying swords to hover behind Tuoba Bodhisattva. Then, he stretched out the hand behind him and dodged the attack. He pressed his palm on Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest, who had not yet landed on the ground, and pushed back with his palm, pushing Tuoba Bodhisattva more than 10 feet away. During this time, Tuoba Bodhisattva's back kept colliding with more than 40 sharp swords. The sound of the flying swords shattering was like a landslide, and the red snakes that coiled around the swords turned into fine powder. Since the beginning of the battle, Su Fengnian, who had the upper hand, did not have the slightest complacency on his face. In his field of vision, the tall man who had been pushed back 3 times in a row still had his clothes intact. It should be known that he had almost used brute force to withstand the one-line sword, the earth sword, and the last push of more than 50 flying swords. This meant that his 3 consecutive sword chi had not broken through the man's gang chi. Of course, Su Fengnian was also far from being at the stage where he was going all out. Both of them seemed to be cautiously and reserved, testing their skills. Since they did not have the confidence to kill in one blow, they would slowly grind it out. It was just that when ordinary martial artists tested each other in the arena, both of them liked to go around in circles and would not punch for a long time. As one of the 4 great grandmasters, Su Fengnian and Tuoba's small test of their skills should be shocking to the world. Bodhisattva Tuoba was still holding onto the sword that belonged to an unknown swordsman in the city. He lowered his head and looked at it. There were red threads circling around the sword. It was the floating sword aura left behind by Su Fengnian. It was also the unique supreme art of the mysterious finger-killing celestial phenomenon from Han Diao Temple in Liang. Tuoba slightly increased the strength of his 5 fingers holding the sword. The tiny red snakes parasitized on the sword trembled for a while before disappearing in a puff of smoke in an instant. Tuoba did not break the sword directly. Instead, he gently tossed it back to Su Fengnian. This silent action was extremely conceited. You, Su Fengnian, have crossed paths with the 2 sword gods of Liang, Li Chungang and Dong Tai. Now that both sword will and sword art can be said to be one of the best in the world, then you can show it to your heart's content. I, Tuoba, will take it all. Su Fengnian did not make any move. After dispersing the 2 sword rivers, more than 100 swords fell in the distance around the 2 of them. They just happened to be inserted into the ground in a big circle, like a thunder pool. In front of Su Fengnian, only the sword that Tuoba had tossed over was left. It hovered on one side of his shoulder, the tip of the sword pointing directly at Tuoba. Tuoba twitched the corner of his mouth. Finally, you are no longer using chi to control the sword. Is it finally worthy for you to hold the sword with your own hands? What an arrogant attitude. Su Fengnian smiled and raised his arm to hold the sword. However, he did not make any reasonable sword movements. Instead, he had already pulled out the sword when he held it. The sword chi burst forth, and the spirit reached the rainbow. A wisp of sword chi, as thick as a dragon's waist, rushed toward Tuoba's face. The latter opened his 5 fingers and casually patted on the aggressive sword chi. The vigorous sword chi exploded in front of him, and it was incomparably brilliant. In an instant, both of Bodhisattva Tuoba's feet were rooted to the ground. His body tilted to the right as though he was about to fall but didn't. A ray of light and shadow flashed past his heart where he originally stood, and a thunderous boom erupted 1,000 feet away. It turned out that Su Fengnian had tossed out the sword. He was the bow, and the sword was the arrow. At that time, before Su Fengnian rushed to the west of Qingsang City to fight with the sword chi, Lu Gui's army had once used ballistas and huge arrows to block the purple chi from the east. The arrows were said to have the monstrous power of sword immortal. When he was young, he read a poem that said, "It's better to get the form than the momentum, and it's better to get the momentum than the rhythm." Therefore, there was a saying that the spirit could be written with the form to be vivid. Su Fengnian naturally did not reach the realm of Confucian sage. However, after meeting Xianyuan Jingcheng, Chao Changqing, and Xia Guining, he had long understood a truth. The book not only contained the Yen Ryu's golden house, but also the celestial state. When Tuoba dodged that arrow, he went to the edge of the thunder pool and quickly pulled out a sword from the ground. He swung his arm and drew a semicircle. Then, he threw another sword at Tuoba. The power of the arrow was comparable to the earth immortal's sword. Although the momentum and force were slightly inferior, it could not withstand the speed and frequency of Su Fengnian's sword. Regardless of whether the arrow missed or whether Tuoba dodged, Su Fengnian was like a diligent old farmer who was harvesting crops in autumn. He pulled out his sword one by one, drew a semicircle with his arm, and shot out arrows one after another. Su Fengnian knew the root of the problem. This was just a rough immortal's flying sword. It could not be used to take a head from 1,000 miles away. To deal with Tuoba, if he wanted to cause a certain amount of damage, it could not exceed 800 feet. The center of the thunder pool where Tuoba was just within the range of this attack. Since Bodhisattva Tuoba had shown that he was willing to be the target, Su Fengnian did not mind at all to let this guy fail miserably at such an easy task. More than 100 immortals' flying swords were strung together like a string of arrows. As expected, Tuoba did not deliberately leave the thunder pool. After dodging more than 60 Earth immortals' flying swords, he was probably a little angry. After that, more than 30 flying swords that were as fast as lightning were mostly smashed by his fists. However, the last 2 swords were only smashed by him. Su Fengnian also used up all his arrows in one breath. The two people's positions did not change. Su Fengnian still had his back to the city, and Tuoba still faced the city gate. Su Fengnian's right arm that had thrown away the sword trembled slightly, but he did not rub it. It was not that he did not want to, but that he could not. He changed his chi at the same time as Bodhisattva Tuoba. However, although the timing of their chi was exactly the same, Bodhisattva Tuoba was still faster than Su Fengnian by a hair's breadth. The seemingly negligible hair's breadth was often the difference between life and death in a fight between great grandmasters. Chapter 1462. When a martial artist ascended to the celestial state, it was like a giant ladder resonating with heaven and earth. It was also like a river connecting to the sea. Logically speaking, as long as there was a chance to breathe, chi could be continuously absorbed from heaven and earth. This was the real reason why there was a saying in the ancient book, as long as the saint is alive, the thief will not stop. However, in a battle between celestial state and above, even if there was a chance to breathe and a person's state could transcend the mortal world, he was still a mortal with a 7-foot body. After all, there was a limit to the accumulation of energy in the body. Usually, there would be excess energy to replenish. This was also why Su Fengnian used the secret flying sword technique of the Wu family's sword tomb. He wanted to use his own will to exchange for Tuoba Bodhisattva's chi and physical strength. However, it was a pity that the speed of Tuoba Bodhisattva's first breath was still faster than his. He had created more than 100 fairy swords with the addition of his 4th sword grip. Su Fengnian quickly raised his arm and blocked his forehead with his elbow. The next moment, he was knocked against the city wall. He did not lean against the tall city wall with his back. Instead, he changed his posture in the process of flying. His feet landed on the ground. After touching the wall, he quickly bent to reduce the force. Su Fengnian squatted on the wall. Under his feet was the wall that was cracked like a spider web. Su Fengnian did not retreat. He suddenly straightened his legs and shot towards Tuoba Bodhisattva. Then, Su Fengnian was punched back to the city wall by Tuoba Bodhisattva. His whole body was embedded in the wall. This majestic city in the western regions was like an old man past his prime. In the end, there were thunderstorms and torrential rain above his head without rest. Even though he had weathered many hardships, it was inevitable that his life would be hanging by a thread. Fortunately, the two culprits who were the ultimate martial artists of the world finally let it go and left the city. However, this sudden storm had already woken up all the people in the city. Many busybodies who were not afraid of death followed the sound and rushed to the city wall. However, when the boldest group of people tried to climb up the city wall to take a closer look, they were knocked to the ground by an invisible and majestic chi. 4 or 5 people who were not skilled in martial arts and did not have enough internal energy were knocked to the ground. Blood burst out from their bodies and they died on the spot, lying in a pool of blood. As for the rest of the fellows who were lucky enough to survive, they only wished that their parents hadn't given them an extra pair of legs. They didn't even bother to wipe off the scarlet blood that continuously flowed out from their 7 orifices as they fled back into the city. They only wanted to get as far away from the gates of hell as possible. This group of people ran through the night streets with their faces covered in blood like malicious ghosts, scaring the busybodies behind them into quickly dispelling any thoughts of joining in on the fun. Then, these miserable fellows suddenly heard a whistling sound above their heads. Under the strong wind, all of them were lifted off the ground and fell heavily to the ground. It was unknown whether they were dead or alive. It was not easy for ordinary people to watch such a fight between immortals. Even if they wanted to clap their hands and cheer from the other side, it would depend on whether they had the luck to do so. It turned out that after Su Fengmian had sunk into the wall, Tuoba Bodhisattva had completely smashed the thick wall out of it. After Tuoba Bodhisattva entered the city, he slowed down his footsteps. If Baoyang wanted to guard the city gate for the central plains, then obediently lock yourself in the gate. How dare you go out of the city to fight? Did you really think that Baoyang's million-strong army was weak? Did Su Fengmian really think that I, Tuoba Bodhisattva, had the heart of a bodhisattva? Wang Xianji cared about the survival of the Jianghu, but I, Tuoba Bodhisattva, was never a Jianghu person. Why would I care if Su Fengmian could continue the Jianghu's life? Tuoba Bodhisattva looked into the distance and finally opened his mouth. He asked in a low voice, "The 1,000 swords have been used up. Do you want to continue borrowing swords? Or do you want to change your blade and start again? If you can use Gu Jintang's Thunder of Mind or Spring and Autumn Saber Armor Qi Lianhua's moves, I don't mind waiting for you for a while to let you take another breath." It was obvious that Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted to use Su Fengmian, who was a great master of the Liang Wulin, to challenge the entire Liang Jianghu. That was why he was so patient and took the beating. Su Fengmian stopped at the city gate between the outer city and the inner city. Not only were his sleeves fluttering in the wind and rain, but his entire robe was fluttering in the wind and rain. It seemed to have offset Tuoba Bodhisattva's fist aura and did not hurt his body. Tuoba Bodhisattva's voice was not loud, but the eardrums of everyone in the inner and outer city were vibrating. Every word entered their ears, even if they covered their ears. It was futile. A flash of white light rushed over from Mount Lantua. She happened to hear Tuoba Bodhisattva's words outside the city. It was the six-pearl Bodhisattva. Her face was pale. She did not dare to delay for a moment and only took 2 breaths. At this moment, she suddenly stood still and threw a sword high up in her hand. She wanted to hand it over to the young man who was as bright as a firefly in the night sky of the western region. However, she was already at the end of her rope and could not control the sword after throwing it. She did not throw it to Su Fengmian's side but instead nailed it to the top of the inner city wall behind Su Fengmian with a distorted trajectory. As for the other saber in her hand, she could not throw it out for the time being with a pale face. Su Fengmian turned his head to look at the ancient sword, Loudness, that was forged in the Dafeng dynasty and was lost in thought. For some reason, he thought of the cicadas that he heard in Wutongan when he was young. Later on, he heard the cicadas for the first time when he traveled in Jianghu before he turned 20. There was also the last time he heard the cicadas when he brought wine to the Tide Listening Pavilion when his master, Li Shan, was still alive. The autumn wind was chilling and the cicadas were mournful on the high branches. The first level, the world thought it was noisy. The second level, the world thought it was sad. The third level, the world sang songs of admiration and loudness for the world. Another day, there was another person who had said something heroic to him under a tree with a grin on his face. If one day you are in Jianghu and hear of a peerless swordsman with the surname Wan, there is no doubt that it is me. Su Fengmian did not take down the famous sword Loudness. Instead, he laughed loudly and said, "If anyone in the city has a wooden sword, please raise it high." In the city, there was a girl named Sima Tieha who happened to be tidying up the family's storehouse. There were a few narrow wooden swords that she used to practice swordsmanship when she was young. When she heard this somewhat familiar voice, she subconsciously grabbed one of the wooden swords and raised it high. She did not care if that person could hear her and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Here! Here!" The next moment, the wooden sword seemed to have a life of its own. It broke through the roof and flew out of her hand. The dumbfounded girl muttered, "Mother did not lie to me. It really was you." Then the girl was somewhat resentful, but at that time I really did not look handsome. Su Fengnian held the wooden sword and walked towards Tuoba Bodhisattva. The world is full of melancholy, the world is not happy. What harm is there? I have the pleasure sword. Su Fengnian's face was full of smiles. Brother, you turned around and left Jianghu. Whether you are willing or not, I will walk a part of it for you. This night, at this moment, the entire city only heard one sentence. Tuoba Bodhisattva. I, Su Fengnian, have a sword that I learned from the swordsman of the Central Plains, Wenhua. This sword, please leave the city. They had never heard of some Wenhua, they did not even know about Liang River Lake. However, the king of Biyao, Su Fengnian, and Beimang's god of war, Tuoba Bodhisattva, these two great names were certainly like thunder in their ears. Then, if Su Fengnian really forced Tuoba Bodhisattva to leave the city with one sword, that swordsman called Wenhua should be quite amazing, right? Chapter 1463. Facing Tuoba Bodhisattva, Su Fengnian held the inconspicuous wooden sword and waved it gently. This was a stance used by many swordsmen in the world. Even a fledgling swordsman who had just held a 3-foot sword for the first time could use it. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression was more serious than when he faced the magnificent 4 swords earlier. Su Fengnian took half a step forward with his left foot, followed by 1 step with his right foot. Then, his left foot took the distance of 2 steps, and his right foot took the distance of 4 steps, and so on. Su Fengnian's steps became bigger and bigger, and the last step was like a long sweep across the sky. This was the same move used by Lu Haoshi, the gatekeeper of Great Peace City, to attack the white-robed Luo Yang. However, the wooden sword was still the same wooden sword. It did not contain any profound sword will, nor did it emit any sword aura. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who did not move, could not help but show a puzzled expression. Of course, he did not think that Su Fengnian was bluffing. This person was still far from being exhausted. Therefore, when Su Fengnian rushed to Tuoba Bodhisattva with the sword in one hand, this was also the first time that Su Fengnian, who played to his strengths and avoided his weaknesses after tonight's battle, took the initiative to engage in close combat. Tuoba Bodhisattva retreating hundreds of feet. His gaze was not on Su Fengnian, but on the simple wooden sword that Su Fengnian held in his hand like a horse dragging a spear. Tuoba Bodhisattva was waiting for Su Fengnian to make a move. When he really raised his sword, there was no perfect move in the world, and Wang Xianji was no exception. However, Wang Xianji's strong physique and strong will made him the undisputed #1 person in the world. Wang Xianji could use a simple punch to defeat all his opponents. It was not because of how brilliant his moves were. Wang Xianji did not care about fancy moves, it was because he wanted to crush his opponents. Tuoba Bodhisattva did not think that Su Fengnian, who was badly injured, had the ability to do so. Otherwise, he would not have schemed so much after the battle. Tuoba Bodhisattva was confident that as long as Su Fengnian used his sword, he would be able to break it. The only difference was that he would need to spend some effort. Today, in Liang and Beimang, the only sword that could force Tuoba Bodhisattva to avoid was the sword of the peach blossom sword god of sword Dong Tai. The sword. Even if Su Fengnian had mastered all kinds of sword moves through a comprehensive study, turning something rotten into something magical and reaching the pinnacle of swordsmanship, he still hadn't completely reached the position where Li Chungang once stood and where Dang Tea stood today. If Su Fengnian had reached the level of Lu Dongxian, the first person in 1,000 years, Tuoba Bodhisattva would not have come to this city to humiliate himself. Tuoba Bodhisattva walked leisurely and allowed Su Fengnian to approach him with his sword. He retreated again and again. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva's bottom line was clear. He would not leave the city. Before the city gate, as long as Su Fengnian did not use his sword, he would not attack. Tuoba Bodhisattva patiently waited for his opponent to reveal what Su Fengnian had up his sleeve. During this time, Tuoba Bodhisattva was still paying attention to the wooden sword. It was not that Tuoba Bodhisattva could not attack immediately after Su Fengnian spoke. However, the more Su Fengnian held the sword, the more he looked like an incompetent swordsman who had just stepped into Jianghu. Tuoba Bodhisattva was naturally more curious. Even after Su Fengnian had taken 16 steps, he still did not sense the slightest Grandmaster's aura from the wooden sword. As a result, Tuoba Bodhisattva could not help but think. Could it be that this sword was just for show from the beginning to the end? Was it just to help the swordsman from the Central Plains named Wenhua become famous in the western region and spread the word? Or could it be that Su Fengnian was playing some boring trick of having the sword in his hand but not the sword in his heart? The reason why Tuoba Bodhisattva could hold back his temper and not attack was because he wanted to pave the way for the inevitable second battle between himself and Dong Tai in the future. The more Su Fengnian used his sword, the greater Tuoba Bodhisattva's chances of winning. In Beimang, it was an indisputable fact that the way of the sword had withered. How could a loftier sword energy satisfy Tuoba Bodhisattva's appetite? Before leaving the city, Tuoba Bodhisattva still had 2 chances to retreat. However, Su Fengnian still had no intention of using his sword. This made Tuoba Bodhisattva vaguely angry. Could it be that this Su Fengnian relied on a broken wooden sword that did not even have a scabbard to scare him out of the city? Therefore, Tuoba Bodhisattva no longer showed weakness and retreated step by step. The tip of his right foot took root on the ground of the street. With a heavy twist, he crushed the stone floor. His left foot suddenly stepped forward. Before the sole of his foot touched the ground, the entire street in front of Tuoba Bodhisattva collapsed. When his left foot stepped down and his right fist punched out, the buildings and houses on both sides of the main street were like wheat fields blown by a strong wind. Thousands of wheat ears could not bear the heavy burden and all fell in the same direction. This strong wind spread throughout the main street, lifting countless pieces of gravel and rushing towards Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian was like a traveler who was traveling against the wind. Since he could not avoid the wind, he would bite the bullet and pass through it. With every step he took, cracks began to appear on his undamaged robe even though it was covered by countless floating scarlet snakes. His black hair fluttered wildly in the wind, and even one side of his face was instantly cut open by the fist aura, leaving small bloody grooves. Tuoba Bodhisattva's heart trembled. This guy actually wanted to shorten the distance by taking the fist aura head-on just to accumulate power for that sword? In the end, when both sides were only one step away from each other, the winner would be decided? Or perhaps, his ambition was even greater. All the previous stingy calculations of a small businessman were all a smokescreen. In fact, he had been lying in ambush all along. Did he want this sword to decide life and death? Previously, there were 2 swords that were separated into under the heavens and on the earth. Later, there were the dazzling 100 swords of the earth immortal that were separated into inner and outer distance. Until now, there had been no signs of this still sword. Could it be that he would only stop after deciding life and death? Just as he expected, the wooden sword in Su Fengnian's hand pointed towards the ground. Generally speaking, the truth of the world could not escape the 4 words of neutrality and peace. If it was simplified, it would probably be the doctrine of the mean that Confucianism advocated. Buddhism had no self, Taoism had no action. It was probably the same with different approaches to achieve the same result. However, at this moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva saw the complicated and turbulent will of this wooden sword that was twisted but still did not release any sword aura. Unwillingness, depression, resentment, grief. I feel very unjust in my heart. Su Fengnian casually raised the wooden sword and pointed the sword at Tuoba Bodhisattva. There was no reason to speak of. The man and the sword, collided directly with each other in an extremely illogical manner. This wooden sword had the meaning of the Jianghu. Resolute and resolute. It was like a crazy gambler who had taken out his life savings and spent a lot of money to decide victory and defeat with God. Chapter 1464. Many years ago, there was a rich young man who was full of ambition for the first time in Jianghu. Unfortunately, it could not be considered a leisurely journey. He did not meet any fairy with fluttering clothes, nor did he meet any chivalrous heroes. He could only be considered to be at the bottom of Jianghu, which was like a rotten quagmire. Even 3 meals a day were a problem. That Jianghu trip was a complete mess. Then, he met a wooden sword ranger who sympathized with him. It could be said that no discord, no concord. When he was stealing melons, he met a fellow traveler. At first, both of them were scared half to death. After that, they became companions. Relying on the knowledge he had accumulated at home in his early years, he always liked to use some of the great principles he had read in books or heard from others to poke at the narrow-minded and shabby ranger. His words seemed to be sincere, but in reality, he mischievously told the guy who always liked to use his clothes to carefully wipe his wooden sword that all the famous swordsmen in the world valued their swords. However, that kind of value, in the final analysis, was because of the sword intent that extended from the 3-foot-long sword in the hand. Which first-class swordsman valued the sword more than the person? If that guy really could not refute, he would only say, "That's someone else's sword. It's none of your business. It's not mine." If he was really forced, he would become angry out of humiliation and hold the wooden sword, threatening, "Do you really think that I don't have a few trump cards in Jianghu?" He would often provoke him by saying, "Come at me if you have the ability." In the end, he would definitely be chased by that guy with the wooden sword. He would say things like, "Monkey plucks peach, black tiger plucks heart," and so on. In fact, he was just using the wooden sword to scare people. What really annoyed him was that there were several times when he was squatting on the ground in the wilderness, to his heart's content. That guy would always jump out at the wrong time and say that he wanted to show him a new set of peerless swordsmanship. As long as he did not praise people until his mouth was dry, that bastard who took advantage of people's difficulties would definitely not stop practicing his swordsmanship. That time when they traveled the Jianghu together, in short, it was during the martial arts competition for a spouse. That guy had rushed up to the arena in high spirits and was beaten down dejectedly. After that, not only did he have to carry that guy out of the arena amidst laughter and rolling eyes, he also had to be responsible for being that guy's practice target. Only then could that bastard, who was determined to become the world's #1 swordsman, regain his composure and continue to be in high spirits. Then, he would go to other places to be beaten. That guy had too many small problems. When he met Gu Liang, who fell in love with him at first sight, he always had to pretend to be her study companion. He always had to lie that the scrawny horse was his mount. If he asked the village women for a few bowls of water to quench his thirst, that guy with a smoking throat would not have the consciousness to repay the kindness of a drop of water. On the contrary, he might even burn the bridge after crossing the river. When he risked his body to be taken advantage of by the village women, he would loudly ask if the man in the house was dead. If he was not dead, he would quickly come out to see the wild man stealing his wife. There were several times when they were almost beaten to death by groups of farmers carrying hoes in the village. Every time he was humiliated or tactfully rejected by the woman he liked, that guy would lose his soul and lie on the ground like a corpse. He did not know whether that guy was heartbroken or not. Anyway, as a spectator, he was really tired. 1 or 2 times was fine, but why didn't he learn his lesson after 17 or 18 times? You used king straw rope to hang a wooden sword on your waist. Every time you squatted by the water, you would ask me and old Huang if I was handsome or not. You would roll your eyes and nod helplessly when you saw us. Do you really think that you are handsome and suave? Those girls with big buttocks and big breasts you met halfway and made you drool had to cry and beg to marry you? In this day and age, young ladies who are slightly more well-off have discerning eyes. Do you think that just because you ride that inferior horse over there, you won't be able to see the miserable scene of your pair of tattered straw sandals exposing the toes of your tattered straw shoes? Those women would be able to tell how many copper coins you had in your pocket with just a quick glance, as if you were wasting money. Later, they met a rich family, a young lady who liked to call herself a heroine. With great difficulty, they were able to live lavishly for a period of time. Finally, they were able to eat proper food in a restaurant. They drank big bowls of wine and ate big chunks of meat. They lamented that their bodies reeked of alcohol and their mouths were greasy meat. This was the kind of life a hero should lead. Later, the girls squandered all the money, and their days began to be tight again. They thought that you would be depressed for a long time, but they did not expect that you would eat the sour dried beans that you stole from the village's grain-drying field. You also said that you tasted the long-lost meat aroma. There was no banquet in the world that lasted forever. First, you said a few words to the girl and gave her half a bag of copper coins that you had secretly saved. After that, you pretended to be a man. That night, you were so distressed that you could not sleep. She teased you and asked you if you wanted to come back. In the end, you angrily picked up the wooden sword and cut it. Finally, you squatted on the ground and sighed bitterly, saying that it was two different things. It was one thing to treat the girl as a friend and be willing to give her as much as she had. You generously squandered all your money. It was another thing to feel distressed. It was the same thing to have two different feelings. It was not contradictory. In the end, the two of them also had to part. That night, sitting on the stone steps of the ruined temple, the nameless wanderer hugged the wooden sword and said that he did not have any savings left. He only had the wooden sword. Even if he was a brother, he could not give the sword away because he would have to rely on it to make a living. He would have to make a name for himself and become one of the best swordsmen in the world. He also vowed that after he made a name for himself, he would definitely return what he owed in the past 2 years. He, Wen Hua, did not have the habit of owing people. He joked that there was no need to return it. He did not expect it. The guy who had never gone to private school and had never read books still said the same thing. Brothers should settle accounts clearly. You gave without asking for anything in return, but I, Wen Hua, would not really laugh and act as if nothing had happened. They were two different things. That time in the extremely destitute Jianghu, old Huang was not skilled at all. That little girl, Liu, dreamed of becoming a heroine even in her dreams. Wen Hua, on the other hand, was a half-baked swordsman. However, many years later, Su Fengnian realized that it was like a jar of old wine. After drinking it, the aftertaste would always be there. That Jianghu, which was full of poor and destitute people, was much more memorable than the wonderful Jianghu that Su Fengnian yearned for when he was young. It was the kind of Jianghu where he could leap over roofs and vault over walls and step on snow without leaving a trace. It was a dark and windy night where he could kill people. Tuoba Bodhisattva's expression kept changing. How did Su Fengnian end this sword? Tuoba Bodhisattva snorted coldly and retreated out of the city. He originally wanted to enter the city quickly after Su Fengnian's unreasonable sword's momentum weakened from its peak. He wanted to return the favor on the spot with a thunderous momentum. At that moment, it would truly be a matter of life and death. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva was stunned on the spot. It was not because Su Fengnian had a backup plan. The sword's momentum was still rising steadily. It was the exact opposite. In the end, that sword only had Qi Yun and not the slightest bit of sword energy. Su Fengnian stood still with his sword in his arms. He could not stop laughing. Wen Hua, did you see that? Your Jianghu, your wooden sword, easily beat a master like Tuoba Bodhisattva out of the city. Su Fengnian inserted the wooden sword into the ground and raised his arms. The ancient sword Fang Sheng and the famous blade Qi Yun flew from the hands of 6-jewel Bodhisattva in the inner city and the outer city respectively. He held them gently. Su Fengnian stepped forward. Before he left the city, he turned his head and looked at the wooden sword. He laughed softly. Next, it's mine. The yellow sand of the desert spun for thousands of miles. Chapter 1465. The mountain range that traversed the western region like a giant sword cutting the western world in half had the reputation of being the ancestral mountain. All the dragon veins in the world originated from here. At a steep mountain pass that ran through the north and south of the western region, the mountains on both sides were dozens of meters high and the path was rugged and deep. This mountain gap was an important passage that connected the north and south of the western region. A caravan of merchants walked through it with difficulty, the sound of camel bells ringing. The merchants were dressed in tight-waisted Hu clothes and sturdy leather boots. Mixed in with them were some women who wore hats to cover their faces. They were also tall and strong. There was a rumor in the Central Plains that the western regions like to order women around like men and men around like livestock. These merchants traveling from the south to the north, regardless of whether they were men or women, all wore machetes at their waists. Some men with outstanding physical strength even hung a unique armor bag near the back of their camel humps. Inside the bag was a rough refined iron chain armor. When they encountered horse gang bandits, they could use camels to replace horses and fight in armor in case of accidents. Suddenly, the caravan was startled by a series of thunder-like sounds from afar. The caravan stopped abruptly and their faces changed dramatically. They mistakenly thought that they had run into a large group of horse gang who were waiting at the mountain pass. More than 50 people pulled out their machetes at the same time. The strong young man even quickly took out his iron armor from his armor bag and put it on. But in fact, everyone knew that if they really encountered horse gang who could create such a scene, they could only kill a few people with their poor combat strength. However, in the chaotic western region that had been without laws for more than 200 years, as long as there were horses and machetes, there would be people willing to work for them. Before the camels lined up neatly, someone with sharp eyes raised his head and saw a horrifying scene. A figure was running from the high cliff, like an eagle hunting for food on the ground. It fell diagonally and landed in front of everyone. After its feet touched the ground, it walked forward 7 or 8 steps due to inertia. It was only 10 steps away from the camel team. Everyone in the caravan was stunned. Some people swallowed subconsciously. They saw that the guy who fell from the sky had a different appearance from the people of the western region. He was young, handsome, and very clean. The young man carried a long sword in a white scabbard on his back and a machete on his waist. After taking a deep breath with dry lips, he raised his arm and made a gesture of drinking water. Then he asked with a smile in the common language of the western region, "Do you have water?" The camel team was silent, not knowing what to do. On the other hand, a woman wearing a hat took off a sheepskin pouch that still had some water left without hesitation and threw it high into the air to the man who looked like a mountain spirit. The young man with the sword and saber expressed his gratitude and quickly leaped out. After catching the water bag in the air, he looked back and grinned. He stepped on the air and turned his body, crashing into the cliff. Then, he bent down slightly and used the momentum to rush forward. He continued to leap over roofs and vault over walls, like when he came. As he ran, he raised the water bag and drank a big gulp of water. After finishing it in one gulp, he casually threw it back, but it happened to land on the head of the woman in the bamboo hat. Just as the woman reached out to catch the water bag, a strong wind suddenly rose in front of the camel caravan. Another person fell from the sky like a falling rock. The strong wind blew and all the camels took a few steps back. The water bag missed the woman and fell lightly on the sand. Without waiting for the crowd to see the person's face clearly, he rose from the ground and disappeared in a flash. Many years later, a rumor about an immortal borrowing water spread throughout the western regions. Hundreds of miles to the south of the mountain range, near dusk, two separatist forces that had dominated the southern part of the western regions for many years fought fiercely over a woman whose beauty spread far and wide. Both sides had more than 2,000 horses and fought at the famous Emerald Lake in the western regions. It was said that after a young king of Biyao became famous, the inferior party hoped to use the beautiful woman in their tribe to exchange for 300 sets of iron armor and 1,000 sets of bows from Biyao, which was the best in the world, so they could dominate the southern part of the western regions. 700 cavalrymen were dispatched to escort the woman to Biyao. Then, they were intercepted at the Emerald Lake. After more than 2 hours of fierce fighting, the pursuers found out that the woman had already taken a detour and sneaked to Biyao. They became angry out of humiliation and swore to kill the cunning tribe until the woman was the only one left. Without a man who could fight on horseback, they would see how they could rise in the desert. Just when the two sides were about to charge from horseback to dismount and fight, the whole battlefield was torn into two halves by a figure. Suddenly, people and horses were thrown off their feet. The front line that was cut open couldn't distinguish between friend and foe. They looked at each other and then at the same time at the guy who broke into the battlefield. They only saw that the man bent his knees, held the hilt of his sword with one hand and the tip of the sword with the other 2 fingers. The sword was held horizontally across his chest. The long sword was bent in a semicircle in front of him. After the dust settled, the long sword still maintained that strange arc and didn't return to its normal position. Another tall and sturdy figure passed through the gap in the battlefield and fiercely crashed into the sword-wielding man with unparalleled strength. The latter's 2 fingers on the tip of the sword rubbed along the body of the sword. The vigorous strength that refused to disperse after charging it, the long sword rolled and condensed in the semicircle. Together with the infusion of his own chi, it finally formed a thunderball with purple lightning lingering around it. With a light flick of his wrist, he held the sword upside down, to meet the enemy. The fist-sized purple lightning ball circled around the tip of the sword. When the tall and sturdy figure that seemed to be attached to the bone appeared 50 steps in front of him, the travel-worn but not dejected young swordsman smiled slightly. Instead of retreating, he advanced. Tai-a was held upside down and thunder was generated in the square inch. This sword had the style of holding the sword upside down that Dong Tai relied on to become famous. It also had the power of Gu Jintang's square-inch thunder. Tuoba Bodhisattva slapped away the purple lightning that was spinning from the tip of the sword to the hilt. At the same time, he stretched out his hand to press on the hilt to prevent the momentum from increasing. He swept a whip kick towards Su Fengnian's neck. When the sword in Su Fengnian's hand was pushed away without any resistance, Tuoba Bodhisattva knew that this guy was up to something again. However, he did not believe that Su Fengnian, who defended more than he attacked, could set up a deadly trap. The whip kick swept out without any delay. Su Fengnian, who had let go of his sword, raised his elbow to block the powerful whip kick. With Tuoba Bodhisattva as the center, Su Fengnian was driven into a complete circle by the kick before he flew out of the circle. It seemed that Tuoba Bodhisattva had the upper hand. However, when Tuoba Bodhisattva's feet landed on the ground, Su Fengnian, who had already used his left hand to hold the hilt of the sword on his right waist while he was spinning, moved closer and closer. The sword was only half an inch out of its sheath. In that half an inch, it shone brightly. The stunned spectators on the battlefield were blinded by the bright light. They could not stop crying even after they closed their eyes. Su Fengnian held the sword but was not in a hurry to pull it out completely. As he rushed forward, the distance between him and the sword increased by half an inch. The scattered light that was like the sun in the sky also converged. It was like water condensing into ice. Although all these changes were complicated, they happened in the blink of an eye between Su Fengnian's advance and retreat. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was calm and unruffled, narrowed his eyes and waited for Su Fengnian to pull out his sword after about 10 steps. Was Gu Jintang's famous square-inch thunder finally coming? As for the purple lightning that was still moving behind him after he slapped it away, Tuoba Bodhisattva did not see it as a threat at all. This was because the speed of the purple lightning's movement was too slow compared to his body's movement. It was too slow. In all the martial arts in the world, as long as one was slower by a hair, it would be useless even if one had the power to topple mountains. Su Fengnian, who was holding the famous Dafeng blade, Qi Yun, closed in on him. Just as Tuoba Bodhisattva expected, he was about 10 steps away from him. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva was wrong about one thing. The square-inch thunder was not released when the sword was pulled out, but when the sword was sheathed again. Between the two of them, there was a sudden clap of thunder. Even if Tuoba Bodhisattva had the physique of a genuine Vajra realm, he did not dare to take the rolling thunder head-on. His palms were facing outwards and he raised them slightly to block most of the force. His body moved sideways with the momentum. Su Fengnian was directly facing the straight line. The sound of the tremors was endless. Hundreds of people on both sides were hit by the strong wind. In an instant, they were uprooted from the ground and fell backward. After Tuoba Bodhisattva avoided the sharp edge, he almost instinctively circulated his chi dynamic 600 miles away to welcome Su Fengnian's true killer move. As expected, Su Fengnian's square-inch thunder was sheathed. The second stroke was a complete unsheathing of the sword. A dazzling white rainbow, like a flood dragon winding across the mountain range, pounced on Tuoba Bodhisattva. Tuoba Bodhisattva's one breath started half an hour ago. His chi was at its strongest. His punch had bent Su Fengnian's soundless sword in front of his chest, knocking Su Fengnian into the battlefield. Although his chi dynamic was inevitably weakened, it was still more than enough to destroy the white rainbow. Tuoba Bodhisattva, who wanted to achieve success with one punch, spared no effort. He bent his arm like a hammer. Not only did he smash the white rainbow, he even smashed the narrow saber. Su Fengnian was trying to exhaust Tuoba Bodhisattva's chi dynamic, waiting for the fleeting gap of breathing. Tuoba Bodhisattva was also waiting for Su Fengnian to exhaust his chi dynamic and take a breath. Therefore, his punch not only exhausted Su Fengnian's chi dynamic, but also forced Su Fengnian to take a breath of fresh chi as he retreated. However, Su Fengnian's response was unexpected. He was not like Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was staking everything. He chose to leave some leeway, allowing Tuoba Bodhisattva's punch to pass through the saber and hit his chest. Su Fengnian's body flew backward in the air like a butterfly. Just as he was about to crash into the ground, the tip of the narrow saber in his hand touched the ground lightly, stirring up a large handful of yellow sand. His body leaned back and his legs stumbled backward, facing Tuoba Bodhisattva. The old chi that had not been released after the previous inhalation dissipated completely. Then, his lips moved slightly and he gently exhaled. To be precise, he was trying to complete the exhalation in one breath. Chapter 1466. Tuoba Bodhisattva sneered. He would not give Su Fengnian the chance to take a breath. Taking advantage of the short gap when Su Fengnian was taking a breath, he took a big step forward and punched with both fists. Although Tuoba Bodhisattva only had 30% of his strength left, if this punch hit, it would be much more effective than Su Fengnian, who took 120% of his strength when he was at his peak. It would be like hitting a snake's weak spot. This guy who was full of tricks would definitely spit out a big bowl of blood. Between heaven and earth, from birth to death, there was one thing that was easily overlooked, and that was breathing. One breath, one breath, one breath, and so on. It was done millions of times when one was awake, and it was done when one was asleep. The breathing technique of Taoism's longevity card was to return to simplicity. It was the most important thing to do in breathing. It was rare for a martial artist in the Vajra realm to kill a Xian finger master from the 3 sections. However, even if it happened, no one would be surprised. This was because the gap between the Vajra finger and Xian finger realms was not much of a gap. The threshold that was really difficult to cross was the celestial state. The reason why Han Diaosi was so famous in Liang Lake and was known as the first person below the land immortals was because of his Xian finger realm. He could fight and even kill a celestial state guru who breathed with heaven and earth. Tuoba Bodhisattva's eyes were stern. He shouted angrily and forced himself to take a breath. He stood still and his feet sank deep into the ground. His fists, which were originally aimed at Su Fengnian, hit each other and his chi increased sharply. It turned out that in the blink of an eye, Tuoba Bodhisattva was shocked to find that Su Fengnian's long sword, which had left his hand, coincidentally, returned to its sheath as if it was pulled by an invisible chi when Su Fengnian stepped back to take a breath. At the same time, the slow, purple thunder that Tuoba Bodhisattva ignored also rushed to his back at a shocking speed. Su Fengnian's mouth was bleeding. He said silently, "Return home." The long sword on his back let out a long whistle in the sheath. It was like the last cry of an autumn cicada, singing to the world. It was like an old man who had left his hometown for many years and only wanted to die in his hometown. More than 1,000 people on the battlefield held their heads and covered their ears. They squatted on the ground, but they still could not reduce the sharp needle-like piercing pain in their eardrums. Behind Tuoba Bodhisattva, there seemed to be a purple golden lotus that was 20 feet tall, blooming with petals. Tuoba Bodhisattva had obviously underestimated the power of the sword returning to its scabbard. He felt as if he had been struck by a bell and had no choice but to take a step forward. His body leaned forward like a hunchback. Only then did he manage to dissipate the force of Tuoba Bodhisattva, without expression. Bodhisattva. Tuoba Bodhisattva, blood, blood, blood. Beimang's god of war. He was not surprised by the new move, nor was he angry because he was at a disadvantage. Along the way, Su Fengnian, who was slightly weaker in terms of chi ji and physique, would use 1 or 2 unique skills that could be used by ordinary Wudao masters every time he took a breath. He would widen the distance between himself and the enemy so that he could take a breather. Tuoba Bodhisattva always thought that it should be the last surprise, but Su Fengnian was always able to pave the way for him when he was in a desperate situation. Li Chuangong's swordsmanship, Dong Tai's swordsmanship, Jian Zhouhuang, Lu Baijia, and Huang Qing's sword moves, Wang Xianji's fists, Hong Shixiang's circle, Lu Haosher's celestial phenomenon, Han Xingxuan's finger mystery, Wang Zhongluo's finger mystery, scholars' qi, fairies' qi. There was no end, no end. This peak battle between the four great masters was a grindstone for each other to sharpen the highest martial arts. In the morning light, a black dot ran along the snow-covered mountain ridge to the peak, like a tiny mustard seed in the vast sea of snow. Carrying his sword and saber, he suddenly stopped. He squatted down and looked higher and farther. He casually grabbed a handful of snow and wiped his cheeks. His palm rubbed the stubble on his chin. After a moment of hesitation, he simply stretched out his hand and took out the spirited saber. Tilting his head, he used the shiny blade to shave his beard. Unlike the first 4 to 5 days of fighting and retreating, the situation between him and Tuoba Bodhisattva had turned around since the battle 2 nights ago. In 1 day and 2 nights, they had fought 6 times. Tuoba Bodhisattva had taken the initiative to retreat 4 times. It was also different from the slow back and forth of the previous battle. Now, one of them would choose to retreat if their attack failed. They did not want to fight a fierce battle, but wanted to kill with 1 strike. After the monk in chicken soup gave him the Buddha bowl, Su Fengnian had been waiting for Tuoba Bodhisattva in the western region city like a fool. He wanted to borrow Tuoba Bodhisattva's fierce attacks to forge the sword embryo that he had absorbed. Both Tuoba Bodhisattva and Su Fengnian had gained something, but it was obvious that Su Fengnian was more likely to gain the upper hand after striking. After Su Fengnian's last ambush failed, he had pursued Tuoba Bodhisattva for more than 200 miles until both of them reached the top of this majestic snowy peak. In the battle of life and death, both of them had formed a certain tacit understanding. The one who retreated would not deliberately hide all of his qi activity. He would always leave some traces for the one who pursued to get to the bottom of it. Tuoba Bodhisattva had clearly told Su Fengnian that he would be waiting on this snowy peak. As for when and where he would launch his killing move without warning, it would depend on Su Fengnian's ability and luck. After Su Fengnian finished shaving his beard stubble, he put his knife back into its sheath. Before he stood up, he grabbed a handful of snow and put it into his mouth, letting it slowly melt and flow down his throat. Su Fengnian straightened his back, 1 hand went to his back to adjust the sword, the other hand pressed on the hilt, and looked up. Suddenly, heavy snow fell, the scale was getting bigger and bigger. It was obvious that Tuoba Bodhisattva had created a huge avalanche with human strength. Su Fengnian was sure that Tuoba Bodhisattva would hide in the heavy snow. He closed his eyes and held the hilt with 4 fingers, his thumb pressed tightly on the hilt of the narrow saber, making the action of pulling the saber out of its sheath. The heavy snow fell from the top of the mountain like a flood, and then split up and passed by Su Fengnian on both sides. Su Fengnian was like a cornerstone, unmoving. Chapter 1467. An ice spear filled with qi was as fast as a rainbow as it pierced towards Su Fengnian's chest. Su Fengnian pushed out the narrow saber from the sheath and brushed past the spear and Tuoba Bodhisattva who was holding it. A piece of flesh was torn off Su Fengnian's shoulder, but a string of scarlet blood was left in the air beside Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian turned around. On the brink of death, there was no lingering fear in his heart. He only felt some regret. If Tuoba Bodhisattva had chosen this moment to decide the victor, Su Fengnian was confident that he could win with a heavy injury that could be temporarily suppressed. He could chop off an arm. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva gave up on this battlefield. He would rather use Su Fengnian's qi to cut a bloody groove on his back. After the avalanche, Su Fengnian sat cross-legged on the ground and panted heavily. He believed that Tuoba Bodhisattva would also be healing at the foot of the mountain. Now, the two of them were no longer fighting over the speed of breathing. They were fighting to end the battle quickly, deciding life and death in one move. Su Fengnian lay lazily in the snow and looked at the sky. He muttered, "Life is as lonely as an avalanche." A large river cut through the canyon and passed through the vast mountain chain that stretched for 3,000 miles. It finally flowed into the sea in Nanzhao. Su Fengnian's forehead was poked by Tuoba Bodhisattva's finger when he was drinking water by the river. He crashed into the bottom of the river. Out of his 10 flying swords, 6 of them were only an inch and a half away from piercing into Tuoba Bodhisattva's temples, eyes, and heart. Tuoba Bodhisattva punched wildly on the river surface, staring at Su Fengnian, who could not jump out of the water. He punched in the river, trying to kill Su Fengnian by suffocating him to death at the bottom of the river. Tuoba Bodhisattva walked on the river surface for a total of 120 miles. In the end, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who forcefully reversed his chi, not only had his arms droop down, but also blood flowed from his ears, nose, and mouth. When Su Fengnian floated out of the water like a corpse, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who could no longer move his arms, could only step on him. Tuoba Bodhisattva knew that he would step on a flying sword controlled by Su Fengnian and his foot would be pierced by the flying sword, but he did not hesitate. Su Fengnian was stepped on in the chest and was once again stepped into the mud at the bottom of the river. For some reason, Tuoba Bodhisattva could not find Su Fengnian's corpse, nor could he find Su Fengnian's remaining aura. This young vassal king seemed to have evaporated from the human world. Just as Tuoba Bodhisattva, who had searched along the river for an entire night to no avail, was planning to return to the Liangmang border, at dawn, Tuoba Bodhisattva saw the young man who refused to obediently report to the king of hell no matter what. He slowly walking out of the river zest, the long sword on his back was nowhere to be seen. He bit the scabbard with his mouth and held the sword with both hands. Both of them did not cross the river. Instead, they slowly walked upstream. Su Fengnian was recuperating while Tuoba Bodhisattva was increasing his chances of winning. After nearly a decade of chasing and killing, both sides ran for thousands of miles. In a dark night with heavy rain that was rarely seen in the western region, they finally welcomed the final battle. It was a simple collision, just like the charge of Liangmang's cavalry. There was nothing fancy about it. Su Fengnian stabbed Tuoba Bodhisattva's abdomen with both hands. Tuoba Bodhisattva punched Su Fengnian's forehead as he retreated. In the end, Su Fengnian first let go of the sword in his hand. Then, he held the sword with one hand. Then, he pinched the sword with 2 fingers. In the end, he could only push the sword with 1 finger. When Su Fengnian completely let go of the sword, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who had a hole in his abdomen, fell back heavily. Su Fengnian, whose hair was disheveled, fell straight back. Tuoba Bodhisattva lay in the mud. He stretched out a trembling hand. Since he could not hold the hilt, he directly held the blade and pulled it out from his abdomen. He used his other elbow to support himself and sat up with difficulty. Su Fengnian still did not move. Tuoba Bodhisattva felt relieved. He smiled and coughed up blood. He looked at the sword in his hand. What a pity. Tuoba Bodhisattva suddenly raised his head. He was stunned and his face was full of bitterness. A sword suddenly flew over and cut through the rain. It was the release sword. It was only at this moment that Tuoba Bodhisattva realized that the sword that had disappeared was actually waiting for this moment. It was waiting for the crucial moment when he, Tuoba Bodhisattva, seemed to have won. To do this, there had to be no deviation in time and place. In order to set up this trap, that person had to take a huge risk and split his attention to worry about the flying sword that was far away in the sky before he attacked with his sword. Before that, he had to first guide the flying sword and then accurately kill him who was right in front of him. It was said that Li Yang's cat had died in this way. Tuoba Bodhisattva sighed softly. Originally, he only needed half an hour to recover and he could easily get rid of that young man. Tuoba Bodhisattva did not regret it too much. He just felt a little regretful and aggrieved. Was there enough time? There was no time. Who would have thought that there would be a day when Tuoba Bodhisattva placed his hopes on someone else? Tuoba Bodhisattva closed his eyes. Suddenly, an old man with a head full of snow stood in front of Tuoba Bodhisattva. He stretched out a finger and blocked the flying sword. The flying sword that could not take the head seemed to be wailing. It was extremely miserable. Su Fengnian, who was lying in the mud, maintained his last bit of clarity. He roughly guessed the identity of this person. The creator of Bimang's spider web, the Shadow Prime Minister Li Mibi. The old man smiled. You have to know that in order to stop Su Yanbing and Tantai Ningjing, this old man had to reach here first. We paid the price of more than 60 masters. In the future, the Beimang Jianghu can no longer be called Jianghu. The old man seemed to be exchanging pleasantries, but his movements did not stop at all. After breaking the flying sword, he went straight to Su Fengnian in the heavy rain and laughed. Su Fengnian, you have lost honorably. Moreover, you only lost to Tianming. Su Shao most likely won't blame you. At this moment, Su Fengnian only felt a splash of water by his ear. He did not know that a red sandalwood box had landed heavily near him. A young woman who had finally arrived after riding a sword for 6,000 miles did not look at Su Fengnian. She only said in a low voice, "You're not allowed to die." Chapter 1468. In the night, a man and a woman were walking towards a brightly lit city at the border of the western regions. However, the posture of the man and woman was a bit strange. The woman was carrying the man on her back while the man was carrying a purple box. Both the man and the woman's complexion were not good. Their faces were pale and yellow. It was as if they were in the same boat. The woman glanced at the city that was particularly eye-catching in the night and asked coldly, "Is this the sleepless city that you mentioned? Why do we have to come here? If we want to get rid of that old mad dog, there are many other options." The man's mouth twitched. He forced a smile and said, "This city is actually called Snow Lotus City. If we are lucky, there will be something we need in this city." The young woman with a terrible complexion but an outstanding appearance frowned and said, "Snow Lotus? Do you need it to treat your injuries?" There were too many descriptions to describe a woman's beauty. She was so beautiful that she could make the birds alight and beasts fall from the sky, outshine the moon, and put the flowers to shame. She was so beautiful that she could cause the downfall of a nation. However, there was no description that could compare to the weight of these 4 words. Only one person in a generation had this kind of beauty. At this moment, this woman might be worthy of this description. Even if she was not the only one, she was at least one of the 4. In terms of appearance, the woman and the man could be considered a good match. He did not explain further. Instead, he raised his head slightly and looked at the city that was full of music and dancing every night. Just as he was lost in thought, he suddenly felt a pain in his head. It turned out that her head had bumped into his head. He, who had suffered countless unexpected disasters, said angrily, "What now? When I woke up, you were the one who said that you wanted to carry me. I wrapped my arms around your neck and was about to be thrown a few feet away by you. Then, I just gently held onto your shoulders and you threw me away. My hands could only shrink in front of my chest. I don't dare to put them anywhere. Do you still think I am being frivolous? Jiang and I. Why don't you just chop off my hands?" Previously, that fellow had inadvertently rubbed against her hair and made her feel itchy. Now, it was this fellow's noisy voice that made her feel irritated. Without hesitation, she tilted her head again, and the 2 heads collided fiercely. It was clearly a move to kill the enemy at the cost of 800. She hatefully said, "I want to chop you up and feed you to the dogs, but even the dogs don't want to eat you." He argued back ungracefully, "You are a dog. Otherwise, how do you know whether a dog will eat you or not?" Snow Lotus City was a small city located outside of the solitary mountain pass. It was located at the border between Nanzhao and Shishu in the western region. This city was famous for its residents who had been harvesting snow lotus flowers for generations. Among the 9 kingdoms of the spring and autumn period, not to mention Nanzhao and Shishu, which were close to the water, even the Liang imperial family, which was ridiculed as the barbarians of the north, would specially add snow lotus flowers as a first-class tribute. Nowadays, the value of snow lotus flowers was almost comparable to the value of gerfalcon in the Liao. The Snow Lotus City was named after the snow lotus. The joys and sorrows of the more than 3,000 local residents revolved around these snow-white plants. Over the past 30 years, these heavenly treasures had become increasingly rare. The appearance of almost every snow lotus would not only cause the snow lotus city to suddenly wake up like a dozing old man, causing the whole city to rejoice. Moreover, it would also cause the city to fall into a bloody storm with undercurrents. Find a place to rest? But that would require money, right? But they didn't. The guy said angrily, "Let's not talk about your ability to kill people. I think you are a sword immortal who can fly 1,000 miles with a sword. Even if you don't have enough money, what's wrong with staying in an inn? If anyone dares to ask you for money, you can take a sword and chop their 18 generations of ancestors until they are convinced. That's it. Do you see it? It's the one with the banner, you chew in. If you don't have the face to eat and dash, I will reason with the innkeeper later." She suppressed her anger, but still followed his words and walked into the inn. The first floor was still full of drunkards. As soon as she stepped through the door, everyone turned to look at them. The woman is carrying the man, and the man is carrying the box. The guy behind her added fuel to the fire. "Stay. Stay. I want a good room." The shopkeeper was a bitter old man with slanted eyebrows. He was originally lying on the counter with sleepy eyes and yawning. When he saw the young man and woman in ragged clothes but with an extraordinary bearing, he glanced at them and was speechless in his heart. Just the red sandalwood box, which could be said to be a big treasure, was priceless. Why did this kind of people, who were destined to be rich and powerful, settle down in such a small temple? The bodhisattva was too big, and the small temple could not accommodate them. The key point was that it was now a sensitive time when two snow lotuses appeared together. The old shopkeeper silently prayed for Buddha's blessing in his heart. He sighed, squeezed out a smile, and personally walked around the counter to lead them to a secluded room on the 3rd floor. Without the old man's order, the waiter, who was usually lazier than a pig, brought the best tea for them. Squinting at the waiter's dazed eyes, the old man pulled him out of the room with all his strength. After bending over to close the door, he softly scolded, "You little brat's heart is too big. Do you think you can take a few glances at that fairy-like woman as you wish? Work hard, save money, and honestly marry Xiao Mei from the wine shop next door. Then you can be content for the rest of your life." The waiter said with grief and indignation, "I won't lose any weight if I look at her more." The old innkeeper slapped the guy's head, "She won't lose any weight, but it's hard to say if you'll lose any weight, you little bastard. That woman looks weak, but she must be a martial artist." The young man's eyes lit up, "She looks so good and is from Jianghu. She can't be the famous purple bamboo fairy, right? Could it be that the purple bamboo knife is in the box? Hey, isn't it fitting that the purple bamboo knife is in the purple box?" The old innkeeper put his hands behind his back and said with a self-deprecating face, "Don't think about it. Purple bamboo fairy has been General Lu's guest for a long time." The young man muttered in a low voice, "Speaking of which, it's strange. Why are there so many fairies and heroines with purple characters in their names now? Last year, Purple Bamboo Fairy and Purple Sword Fairy came to the city to buy snow lotuses, right?" The old innkeeper rolled his eyes and said, "God knows. If you have the ability, why don't you ask these fairies yourself?" Inside the room, she threw the guy onto the bed and put the red sandalwood sword box on the table. She sat on the chair and closed her eyes to rest. First, she rode the sword for thousands of miles from the misty Guangling Road to the desert of the western regions. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she had to experience a life and death battle with the old Beimang dog. After that, she had to carry the burden and flee for hundreds of miles. She had no time to rest, which made her body's qi flow extremely chaotic. There was a deep bloody wound on her neck that was so deep that her bones could be seen. She only needed to bandage it. If it wasn't for the fact that the old man named Li Mibi also needed to protect Tuoba Bodhisattva, she might not have been able to reach this city. Whether it was the old man with the sheepskin fur coat who taught her to practice calligraphy instead of swordsmanship, or Uncle Chow who was waiting for the imperial order, they all clearly explained the difference between the two. When she first met him in the torrential rain, she manipulated the rainwater and mud into several thousand swords, setting up 2 sword formations. Li Mibi still broke the sword formations effortlessly. During their escape, she did everything she could to turn everything into a 3-foot sword, but all along Li Mibi was strolling in the courtyard, following her like a shadow. The man was Su Fengnian, who survived the disaster. At this moment, he was lying on the bed and said softly, although Li Mibi is only at the finger xian level, his skills are somewhat similar to Cat Man Han Xingxian. He is invincible in the same level. As for the ordinary celestial level, it is difficult to suppress him. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the ancestor of Beimang's spider web spy. However, don't be fooled by how easily he broke the sword formation and showed the style of a master. In fact, your sword formation made the old man tremble with fear. It's just that the old man is thick-skinned and you can't see it. If he didn't puff himself up at his own cost, he would have scared you into only defending and not attacking. If you killed Tuoba Bodhisattva, how would he sneak back to the Beimang Empress? She sneered and said, "Are you blaming me?" She didn't expect a sharp rebuttal from the guy. Instead, she became even angrier and said angrily, "Someone didn't kill the opponent in one breath and almost had his head taken back to receive a reward. That's really amazing. No wonder he is one of the 4 great masters in the world." If I remember correctly, at that time, the Jianghu people were talking about the new martial emperor after old monster Wang. TSK. Someone paid someone to help talk nonsense in the Jianghu, right? Su Fengnian said weakly, "Please, the person who was almost killed by me at that time wasn't some weakling. He was Tuoba Bodhisattva." If Li Mibi didn't appear to mess things up, would have swaggered to the Liangmang border and rode out alone. The head of their Beimang military god would be hanging on the tip of my spear, okay? Then the morale of Beimang would have fallen to the bottom. It would be more useful than killing 200,000 of their cavalry at the border. Simply put, 100,000 of our Beiliang people would have died less. Chapter 1469. Jiang and I didn't care about the ifs and interrupted his daydream. She snorted and said, "In the end, you still have to hide here like a stray dog." Su Fengnian laughed and said, "If I'm a stray dog, how much better are you? Wouldn't we be a cheating couple?" For the first time, Jiang and I didn't talk back. She remained silent. Su Fengnian sat up with difficulty and looked at the lights outside the window. Tuoba Bodhisattva will definitely recover faster than me. With Li Mibi, who is good at killing and setting up ambushes, we can only delay and go south. We can only wait for Su Yanbing and Tantai Pingjing to bring people south and force Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi to give up. I believe that in at most half a day, the 2 of them will give up and secretly return to northern Mang. This gamble is very risky for both sides. Even if Li Mibi is willing to take Tuoba Bodhisattva and gamble with me, Beimang won't agree. Tuoba Bodhisattva knows the severity of the situation. Jiang and I coldly asked, "When will you be able to walk on the ground?" Su Fengnian smiled bitterly and said, "It will probably take another 2 days. Tuoba Bodhisattva and Li Mibi will probably only need 1 day to follow the tracks to Snow Lotus City. This means that you will probably have to fight again. Of course, this is the worst outcome. If my luck is not so bad, they might already be on their way back to the north." Su Fengnian suddenly looked tired and said helplessly, "But my luck doesn't seem to be very good now." Jiang and I frowned and said, "How can you ask people for Snow Lotus with your half-dead appearance?" Su Fengnian laughed and said, "Don't tell me you think that there is no place for Beiliang to hide our strength in Snow Lotus City?" Jiang and I couldn't help but turn around and ask, "Is this inn run by a spy from Beiliang?" Su Fengnian joked, "Do you think it will be so shabby?" Jiang and I, who hated being led by the nose by this guy, glared at him. Su Fengnian leaned against the bed and said with a smile, "Can I trouble you to ask the old innkeeper for supper?" Jiang and I hesitated for a moment, but still went downstairs to ask for a portion of food from the unlucky old man with the slanted eyebrows. Then, she asked for an extra room on the 3rd floor. Since the inn didn't ask for any money from them from the start to the end, she felt at ease and acted extravagantly. Su Fengnian only saw the old innkeeper enter the room with the food box, but did not see her figure. She let out a sigh of relief and said with a smile, "Innkeeper, don't worry. I won't shortchange you for the accommodation. I don't know if the innkeeper has any connections at the Snow Lotus house." I heard that the Snow Lotus House in Snow Lotus City is a first-class brothel in the southern part of the western regions. Whether you can buy Snow Lotus here depends on fate, but whether you can eat the women of the Snow Lotus House depends on whether you have enough money in your pocket. As for me, I have a little bit of money. I want to take advantage of the fact that we are sleeping in separate rooms and take advantage of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a trip to Snow Lotus City worth it. The aged shopkeeper immediately smiled knowingly, but he soon frowned and said cautiously, "To tell you the truth, the inns and restaurants in the city all have these big and small connections. They just think about how to serve the guests well, and how to come and go in high spirits. Since the old man's pleasure and dares to use such a name, of course, we have our own methods. However, young master may not know that the girls in the Snow Lotus Tower are very arrogant, just like the concubines in the palace. No matter what status they have, those girls will not go out of the tower to receive guests. However, the girls from the other families are not so particular. This old man can make connections with them and let them come here prettily without anyone noticing. I guarantee that young master won't know about it. Moreover, young master's taste can also be decided in advance. Taking a step back, if young master is afraid that they are not to your taste, this old man can also sell my old face and let them come here more. Young master can choose the ones that you like. Young master, what do you think?" Su Fengnian shook his head and said with a smile, "Forget about the girls of the other alleys. We are eating the signature of the Snow Lotus House. Whether the girls are beautiful or not is not the most important thing. When we go back, we can brag about it to our brothers. Otherwise, we can eat anywhere. Can the girls of Snow Lotus City really be more beautiful than the courtesans of the Central Plains? Innkeeper, don't you think this makes sense? How about this? Shopkeeper, I used to have a friend who was a regular customer of the Snow Lotus House. He spent thousands of taels of silver there. You go to the brothel keeper of the Snow Lotus House and tell her that there is a friend of young Master Su in Fushui Prefecture who wants to have a drink with the courtesans in the house. Let them pay the price. As long as they dare to bid, I will dare to bid. Innkeeper, as long as you pass the message, no matter whether the deal is successful or not, when we check out and settle the bill, I will add the extra carriage fee." When the old innkeeper heard this, he was overjoyed and ran to pull the strings. Not long after, Su Fengnian saw the door open. She stood there with a fake smile. Without waiting for him to explain anything, she slammed the door and left. Less than an hour later, the door was gently knocked. Su Fengnian said calmly, "Come in." Two women walked into the room and deliberately changed into ordinary clothes. However, when they took off the veil that covered their faces, one of them was a middle-aged woman and the other was in the prime of her youth. Both of them were outstanding women who had their own romantic styles flowing from head to toe. After seeing Su Fengnian's appearance, the young woman's eyes were filled with curiosity and scrutiny. The plump woman, who had been trembling with fear along the way, was so scared that she directly dropped to her knees. She didn't dare to say anything and didn't even dare to breathe heavily. Su Fengnian said softly, "Mrs. Song, please get up. Sit down and talk." Even Lu Qiu, who is known as a heartless and unscrupulous person in Liyang, secretly respects Mrs. Song. The woman's eyes were red. After getting up, she curtsied and sat down. Su Fengnian asked with a smile, "Is this the next courtesan Yu Qingling of Snow Lotus House?" The woman, who had already recognized Su Fengnian, nodded and replied respectfully, "Yu Qingling is an orphan in the Snow Lotus City. She entered the Snow Lotus House since she was a child. She is my confidante. However, for the sake of caution, she was only registered in the third-class room of the Whispering Room 4 years ago. Last year, she made a small contribution and was promoted to the second-class room this spring. Currently, she is in charge of keeping an eye on the number 1 local snake, Lu Huaishi. This person is nicknamed General Lu. He was born and raised in Snow Lotus House. He has more than 1,000 men under his command and is also very influential in Nanzhao. Among them, several familiar forces are deeply grateful to Lu Huaishi. I suspect that Lu Huaishi was first supported by Zhao Go of Liyang. However, 3 of Zhao Guo's spies died one after another in autumn and winter last year. Whether Lu Huaishi has been instigated by Bei Meng or Shishu, we need Yu Qingling to find clues. If Yu Qingling can recruit people for Fu Shui House, she will be worthy of her status as a second-class room. Su Fengnian smiled and said, Lu Huaishi was able to move between several major forces and constantly grow his strength. First, he stood out from the crowd. After he gained a firm foothold, he became a feudal lord in the southern part of the western regions at the age of 35. Such a bold and ruthless person naturally has a lot of charisma. According to the spy report, even the daughter of Nanzhao's royal prince Li Yang was willing to be his woman behind the scenes and didn't hesitate to elope for him. The woman looked at the woman who was standing there in a daze and didn't know what to do. She smiled gently and said, "It's best if a sheep enters the tiger's mouth and can retreat after success. It wouldn't be strange even if there are no bones left. However, if you help the tiger do evil, you deserve to die." Since Yu Qingling has joined the Whispering Room, she can distinguish between public and private matters. Her next sentence fully displayed Madame Song's iron-blooded demeanor as a top spy. If there is a mistake, this servant will clean up the house myself without the need for the Whispering Room's instructions. This servant will also ask head shopkeeper Chu for punishment if I don't know how to use people. Yu Qingling bit her lips and stood there elegantly, which made her look even more pitiful. Su Fengnian didn't comment. He looked at the beautiful woman who was well known in Snow Lotus City and said, "Yu Qingling, what kind of person do you think Lu Huaishi is? Tell me the truth." She still couldn't guess who this young master was. However, since Madame Song, who had the nickname of Empress Dowager, in Snow Lotus House, was so serious about this matter and didn't hesitate to humiliate herself to the point of calling herself this servant, Yu Qingling believed that this young master must be an important person of the Whispering Room who had come to Snow Lotus City. Although she was nervous, she carefully chose her words and replied, "He is cruel and merciless, but he is affectionate and loyal." Su Fengnian smiled and dismissed it. Is there any ready-made Snow Lotus in Snow Lotus City recently? Chapter 1470. The woman said, "What a coincidence. Not only is there one, but there are 2 of them. One was found by Lu Huaishi's mansion and the other was found by the young man in the city from his father's last words. He waited for 6 years and went to the Snow Mountain 4 times to check on the lotus bud. After much effort, he finally found it this year. The former was waiting for a good price. It was rumored that Lu Huaishi's original intention was to give the snow lotus to the commandery prince of Nanzhao as an apology to his father-in-law. Later, it seemed that the weaving bureau of Shishu and Nanjiang wanted to buy it and give it to the current empress. However, there was also a top master from the Central Plains who had been waiting for many years. He said that he was willing to sell his life for Lu Huaishi in exchange for the snow lotus. It seemed that he wanted to cure a woman's illness. After the young man brought the snow lotus and carried an old man who lost his legs back to the city, the various forces started a new round of competition. After all, the snow lotus was too rare. It was sold at a high price of 30,000 taels of silver 30 years ago. Now, it was even more priceless. Even 100,000 taels of silver might not be enough to buy it. However, the ignorant young man was stubborn. He said that he did not want to sell his snow lotus and only wanted to give it to a girl from Ma family fort. The girl was the daughter of the Ma family fort's fort master. Her father had already arranged a marriage between the 2 families. Perhaps she had some interaction with the young man, which made the young man so stubborn that he was willing to risk his life for the snow lotus. Right now, the young man and the snow lotus stored in the ice cellar are blocked at the door by that Central Plains master. The 2 of them must have reached some kind of agreement. Without the protection of that Grand Master of Swordsmanship, the young man's corpse would have been long gone. Song Fu lowered his voice and asked, "Do you need the Snow Lotus House to fight for the 2 snow lotuses? If so..." Su Fengnian waved his hand and said, "There's no need for the Snow Lotus House to get involved. Just tell me the exact location of the 2 snow lotuses." Madame Song's eyes were burning with determination. She said in a low voice, "Since the Fushui House set up the Snow Lotus House in this city, is it just for show? How many people have died at the border between Liang and Yu? Even if the Snow Lotus House is wiped out, How many people can die? Su Fengnian smiled and said, Madame Song said that the Snow Lotus House is fair. I should do the same. Madame Song shook her head. It's not the same. Su Fengnian looked at the woman who seemed ready to die at any moment and said calmly, I have the final say. Mrs. Song was stunned. Su Fengnian glanced at the door, coughed, and said to Madame Song, I'll have to trouble Madame Song to ask the inn to prepare a carriage for me. I need to immediately go to the lotus-picking youth's place. Madame Song, you can just give the coachman directions. Oh right, give the innkeeper more money. If I need anything in the future, I will definitely look for your Snow Lotus House. If not, don't act on your own accord. Just treat it as the rules of the water room. The two carriages parted ways outside the inn. Madame Song sat in the carriage with an expressionless face. Yu Qingling, who was about to go to General Lu's residence to feed the tiger with her body, mustered up her courage to ask something. Madame Song, with her eyes closed, said coldly, Don't ask what you shouldn't ask. In the other carriage, Su Fengnian sat leaning against the wall. Jiang and I sat upright with his back against the red sandalwood sword box. His expression was uncertain. After 7 or 8 turns, the carriage came to a narrow and dark alley. The simple and honest coachman stopped the carriage, lifted the curtain and said apologetically, Young master, young miss, the alley is too small for the carriage to enter. You will have to walk 34 steps forward. Jiang and I got off the carriage first and said, Walk by yourself using the wall. Su Fengnian had a bitter smile on his face. With the help of the coachman, he got off the carriage and told the coachman not to wait for them to return to the inn first. He really had to use the wall to walk. He was in a sorry state. Jiang Ni's steps were not big. She walked slowly less than 6 steps in front of them. She did not forget to sneer, If you go to that Snow Lotus House to spend the night, won't you be unable to walk by yourself tomorrow? That was not all. She added, Forget about the girls in the other alleys, we'll be eating the signature dishes of the Snow Lotus House. TSK, you're indeed a hedonistic son of a wealthy family. These words sound like something only a veteran in the field of flowers could say. Su Fengnian laughed angrily, Eavesdropping on other people's conversation makes you sound so righteous? Jiang and I snorted, My ears are sharp. Otherwise, do you think I'm happy to hear such filthy words? The two came to a dilapidated yellow mud house without a wall. Jiang and I carried the red sandalwood sword box and stood with her arms crossed in front of her chest. Su Fengnian had to put one hand on her shoulder to stabilize himself. However, she dodged, so Su Fengnian had to bend over with his hands on his knees. A middle-aged man with a sword on his knees was sitting on the stairs in front of the house. He should be the swordsman from the Central Plains who was known as a grandmaster of martial arts in the eyes of Snow Lotus City. Su Fengnian did not know this person. It seemed that this person, who had stayed in Snow Lotus City for 4 or 5 years, did not recognize him in Jiang and I. As for those guys lurking in the darkness, Su Fengnian knew that a skinny camel was still bigger than a horse. Although he was weak and could be blown away by the wind, he could sense clearly with his will of divine. Although he could not defeat Li Mixi and Tuoba Bodhisattva, he could kill them all without lifting a finger. Moreover, he had Jiang and I by his side. As long as it was not the 14 people of Wu Ping or the great grandmaster who was only 1 step away from getting involved, it would not be a problem. The swordsman looked straight ahead and said indifferently, I don't care about Lu Huaishi's Snow Lotus, but I have already reserved the one in the house. You can leave now. If you don't want to give up, you can ask my sword. Su Fengnian gasped for breath and raised his head to stare at the middle-aged swordsman who had the demeanor of a master. He asked with a smile, If I may be so bold as to ask, do you have a famous nickname? The swordsman did not answer. Instead, a hearty and loud voice came from the house, What bullsh***t hero? This old man was defeated by Dong Yuanrui of Dongyue in the past. He could be defeated with one hand. Jianghu is getting more and more ridiculous today. How can this kind of trash be considered a person with a broken sword? This old man's generation was really full of heroes. Let's not talk about others. Let's talk about those who fought with this old man. There was the overlord of Cold Land, Wuxia, who used a spear, and the green-robed ancestor of Fengdu. They could barely be considered masters. When this old man fought with them, it was just a warm-up. Only the swordsman with the surname Li was this old man's fated enemy. However, they appreciated each other. However, a young voice in the house interrupted the old man's irrelevant boasting. All right. I carried you out of the cave in the snow-capped mountain. A real man does not boast about his past achievements, do you know that? Eat your pancake. Su Fengnian was confused. He turned to look at Jiang and I. The corner of her mouth moved, and she said coldly, there is no such person. The old man with the sheepskin fur coat never mentioned him to me. Su Fengnian whispered, his qi is not even at the level of level 2 master now. I think he will barely reach the threshold of level 1 when he is at his peak. However, his qi is even more powerful than old man Li's. Then Su Fengnian saw Jiang and I walking forward and asked, what are you doing? Jiang and I said indifferently, go in and beat him up. So that he won't be boasting without a draft. Su Fengnian did not know whether to laugh or cry. He is already so old. Why can't I have a taste of my mouth? Moreover, he was full of pride. Didn't he still put old man Li at the top of the list? Just based on this point, I want to drink a few bowls of wine with this old senior. Only then did Jiang and I stop, but she suddenly turned her head to look at the corner of the alley. Su Fengnian followed her line of sight and saw a budding young girl leading a juju-bred horse. She had a kind of indomitable will that only a newborn calf would have, and she would not care about anything. After the young girl walked into the tiger's den, she looked at Su Fengnian cautiously. When she saw Jiang and I, she smiled. This made Su Fengnian a little depressed. The young girl led the horse and shouted, Hong Shuji, don't be stupid. Quickly find a buyer for that snow lotus. Do you hear me? That's all I have to say. I'm leaving. The young girl's back was facing the house. She tried not to make it too obvious that she was crying. In the future, we will go our separate ways. A sallow and emaciated young man rushed out of the house. His face was full of tears. He wiped his tears with his hand and shouted, Ma Gong, your father said that as long as I pluck the snow lotus, he will not let you marry that bastard. The young girl turned her head and said angrily, my father only wants you to die in the snow mountain, you idiot. So what if you pluck the snow lotus? The young girl raised her hand to cover her face. She sobbed, we can't be together. The young man also cried, I don't care. I don't want you to be with me now. Anyway, that guy is not a good person. As long as you don't marry him, it will be fine. I will be very happy. Su Fengnian was still bent over. His expression could not be seen clearly. Then, Jiang and I walked closer and kicked his calf. Su Fengnian asked, what's wrong? She widened her eyes and said angrily, you don't care? She quickly added fiercely, if you don't care, I will. Su Fengnian smiled. He put one hand on his back and slowly straightened his back. He smiled brightly, let me take a breather first. Care, how can I not care? Su Fengnian looked at the young man and the young girl. He sighed, that's great. Chapter 1471. The dilapidated house, the bright moonlight, and the gloomy and cold alley. There was a Wu Dao grandmaster holding a sword, a sad skinny boy, a young girl holding a whip, a sick man gasping for breath, and a beautiful woman carrying a purple box on her back. In the eyes of the sneaky night walkers lying on the roofs, the scene in front of them made them feel less bored after coming here in the middle of the night. The night walkers were divided into several groups, each with their own benefactor. Among them, the ones with the largest numbers and the aura of a battlefield were the elite soldiers from Lu Huaishi's mansion. They also rightfully occupied the two adjacent roofs with the widest view. The weapons hanging from their waists were all sabers, but there were a variety of them. There were Miaodao with a slender blade that looked like a seedling, and there were also sabers that came from the southern dynasties of Beimang to the western regions. There was even an old cold saber carried by a man in black who looked like a leader. Only those who were familiar with the Biyao frontier army could tell that it was a cavalry saber with a more prominent curve than a walking saber. As Biyao became stricter with the control of the sabers and crossbows, the value of these cold sabers spread among the people in the early years also rose. They could easily be sold for a sky-high price of 700 to 800 taels of silver. On Liang Lake, if there was a cold saber hanging from one's waist, as long as it was not the kind of person who could see through it at a glance, people would involuntarily be afraid of it. A guy approached the man in black who carried the cold saber and whispered, "Leader Chi, the woman below with the purple box on her back is really beautiful. She's even more beautiful than the purple bamboo fairy who came to our mansion as a guest. Why don't we just take action? The whole Snow Lotus City is ours. As long as we enter the city, our lives will be in our hands." "Leader Chi, didn't the general say that you need a wife? I think this woman is very good. We just discussed that we'll send the Snow Lotus to the general's mansion, and tie this woman directly to your mansion. Today, we'll hold a wedding banquet for you and make a scene in the bridal chamber. Then, we won't waste our night in the cold." The man in black who had been instigated by his subordinates to become a mountain king subconsciously stroked his scabbard. His rationality overcame his desire. He shook his head and said, "Don't ruin my foster father's great plans." He was the direct subordinate of Lu Huaishi, the Earth Emperor of Snow Lotus City. He had once followed Lu Huaishi in and out of the 100,000 Great Mountains, which was why he was bestowed with this cold saber that Lu Huaishi loved so much. His purpose on this trip was to keep an eye on that Central Plains man who wielded a sword. Lu Huaishi was determined to obtain that Snow Lotus because he had publicly announced that he would offer it to a woman with the same name in Western Shu. It was said that she was an extremely beautiful woman, but it was a pity that she was in existence that even Lu Huaishi could not afford to offend. The Snow Lotus obtained by the lotus picker in his residence had another secret use. Because he was one of Lu Huaishi's followers who had followed Lu Huaishi since his youth, he was qualified to come into contact with some of the inside stories. It was said that there were 10 new sects in Liang, and the Dragon Palace of Nanjiang was one of them. The new palace master, Lin Hongyuan, was not only the leader of the Jianghu in Nanjiang, but also had a close relationship with His Royal Highness, Zhao Zhu, the King of Yen. He did not know what his foster father was plotting, but it was definitely not limited to Snow Lotus City. His foster father had secretly revealed his yearning for the Central Plains more than once. "Boss Chi, look. That guy seems to be reckless and wants to interfere. What should we do?" The dragon moth adopted by Lu Huaishi frowned and squeezed out a word from between his teeth, "Wait." The tuberculosis ghost who had come out of nowhere to mess things up called the young boy and girl to the side and muttered to them like a lousy accountant. Sure enough, the young boy's face was full of suspicion, while the young girl with an extraordinary background was not tempted at all. It was one thing for the young boy and girl to have a wide vision, but in the face of a great change, they were still a little wary. Who would believe that a stranger who appeared out of nowhere, who could easily push them down with a single finger, would paint a big picture for them out of thin air? When the dragon moth on the roof stole a glance at the stunning woman, especially when he saw her looking at the scholarly young man, he, who had always thought himself to be hard-hearted, suddenly felt his blood boil. Then, he elegantly jumped down. More than a dozen brothers who had depended on each other for many years also did not want to be left behind, and they all landed on the ground one after another. Apart from the 3 archers who stayed on the roof in tacit understanding, the rest of them were all ready to help the dragon moth on the roof. Everyone had a frivolous smile on their faces, and they almost called the woman sister-in-law. Su Fengmian was talking until his mouth was dry. He told the young boy that as long as he had Snow Lotus, he could guarantee that the young girl would not get married. In fact, the young boy was somewhat tempted. However, the young girl who came from a wealthy family outside of Snow Lotus City mercilessly exposed his lie. Su Fengmian said that he could protect them and safely leave Snow Lotus City. She said that he had to fight with the swordsman from the Central Plains on the steps first, and then they could talk about other things after he won. Su Fengmian said that he could. She then said that there were many experts around General Lu in the city. Her father's Ma family fort also had 100 cavalrymen and 200 archers. Not only did he have to defeat the swordsman, he also had to go to the general's mansion and fight with the Ma family fort. Su Fengnian was originally afraid that the two children would misunderstand his lack of sincerity if he agreed too quickly, so he casually asked how powerful Lu Huixi was. As a result, the young girl rolled her eyes at him and said that he was actually a Jianghu swindler who wanted to do business without any capital. He just wanted to cheat the Snow Lotus and then quickly run away. Su Fengnian's physical strength was exhausted, so he squatted down. When he raised his head and was about to speak, the young girl looked down on him even more. She, considerately, told Su Fengnian to just lie down and talk. This way, his legs wouldn't hurt and his waist wouldn't hurt. Su Fengnian laughed and said that the real experts in Jianghu didn't fly around and pretend to be masters. They all liked to pretend to be weak and subservient like him. The young girl's mouth was unforgiving. She said that Su Fengnian wasn't pretending to be subservient and was a real subservient. The young boy who had been watching from the side wanted to laugh, but he held back his laughter. He secretly made a face at Su Fengnian, taking pleasure in his misfortune. Su Fengnian laughed and scolded the young boy. She hasn't married into the family yet, but she's already in charge of both internal and external affairs. Aren't you afraid that your husband's authority will be lowered in the future? The young boy, who was simple and honest but wasn't really stupid, chuckled. The young girl flew into a rage. She gripped her horsewhip tightly and pointed it at the guy who was speaking more and more nonsense. Her face was frosty, and she wanted him to get lost. In the end, Su Fengnian's next words made her completely calm down. What's wrong? Now that Hong Shuji is in danger, your conscience is uneasy, and you want me and that beautiful big sister, two outsiders, to stay out of this matter, even if it doesn't work out? Girl, aren't you a little too soft-hearted? Lu Huixi's lackeys were about to fight when the person with the cold blade at his waist raised his hand to stop them. He said softly, "Something's not right." Then, a wild laughter came from inside the house. You bunch of idiots who don't know Buddha when you meet a real Buddha. What the hell are you shouting about? Like a wild horse, a figure broke through the paper-like walls of the mud house and floated out. First, it jumped over the head of the swordsman who didn't move at all. Then, it passed between Su Fengnian and Jiang and I. Finally, it crashed into the ranks of Lu Huixi's elite soldiers. The Lu family's bodhisattva, who had been fighting for a long time, shouted angrily. He pulled out his blade and held it with both hands. Using his body to push the blade forward, he rushed forward quickly. His steps were not in a straight line, but were unusually complicated and agile. It was a mixture of the Western Shu Xingyi and the Southern Tang Tongbi style. His movements were very clean. The figure that rushed out of the house flashed and brushed past the bodhisattva in the blink of an eye. Not only did he kick the bodhisattva's chest, he also took the blade with his bare hands. The bodhisattva's momentum did not decrease. He rushed straight to the mottled wall of the alley, stabbed the blade into the wall, and flipped over. When the young man who was respectfully called Head Chi stopped staggering and turned his head to look, he saw an old man whose two calves seemed to have been cut off by a sharp weapon. The old man was sitting on his beloved blade. He looked around complacently and said loudly, "Yo, young man, you have some weight. Unfortunately, you have encountered this old man. Even if I give you 20 years of hard work, it still won't be enough." The domineering old man glanced at the middle-aged swordsman who did not stop him from leaving the house and said indignantly, "This old man has returned to Jianghu this time and waited in this shabby little town for so many days. Other than that blockhead on the stairs who only has a killing sword but not a heart, no one actually took the initiative to burn incense and worship the gods. Do you really want this old man to start a massacre so that you ignorant frogs at the bottom of the well will understand that there is a land immortal in your Snow Lotus City?" The head chi of Snow Lotus City turned his head and spat out a mouthful of blood. His eyes were malicious and cold. He shook his wrist and asked with a smile, "Old immortal, do you really want to be the enemy of the general's residence?" The old man laughed and said, "What bullshit general's residence? A bunch of blind people. If you really annoy this old man, he will kill you all in an instant." At this time, Su Fengnian smiled at Jiang and I, who had quietly walked a few steps closer to him, and said, "Learn from him. Look at how the old senior walks the Jianghu. Let me tell you, in our line of work, if you don't know how to smile evilly, then you are definitely a fledgling of the Jianghu. Similarly, the evil experts in the Jianghu, this kind of laughter is only a beginner's skill. As for the righteous experts, they must have the demeanor of an immortal. After one move, they must stand with their hands behind their back. At night, especially on a moonlit night, it is the best scene. Think about it, if you put on the posture of looking up at the moon, you will have the demeanor of a great master and won't hurt your eyes. But there's a way, and that's to narrow your eyes and remain silent. Don't speak at all. You can't speak big words. Once you do, it'll lower your status. If you don't say anything, it'll make the bystanders, like us, feel that you're unfathomable. Jiang and I said unhappily, "You are so boring." Su Fengnian glared at him and said, "This is the priceless advice that I personally came up with after wandering the Jianghu. If others want to listen to it, I will not sell it to them." The Ma Jiabao's daughter, who was eavesdropping on Su Fengnian's teaching, quickly exposed him. "You are indeed an experienced Jianghu swindler." Chapter 1472. The young man listened with great interest. He felt that these words made a lot of sense. Every time those rich kids in Snow Lotus City flirted with girls on the street, didn't they like that kind of devilish smile? Also, every time they opened their folding fans, they would open them with a crisp sound and close them with a snap. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't learn that kind of smile. Of course, he couldn't afford that kind of fan either. Therefore, the young man was filled with curiosity and asked softly, "Is there anything else?" Su Fengnian proudly snorted and said, "Yes, there is. The knowledge behind this is as deep as the sea. Kid, let me ask you, are there any heroines in Snow Lotus City whose nickname starts with the character Z? They either like to wear purple clothes or wear purple accessories. There must be some, right?" The young man was startled, and his eyes were filled with admiration. He nodded vigorously and said, "Young master, you are amazing. In this year, there were 3 or 4 immortal sisters who were like this." The young girl curled her lips and said, "What's so great about being able to guess this kind of thing? In Snow Lotus City, there are many young heroes who wear white robes and have 2 blades hanging from their waists. Every one of them claims to be someone's closed-door disciple. They either like to lie on the street drunk and look at the moon, climb up the city wall and pretend to be in a daze, or they like to run to the Snow Lotus Pavilion to show off their poetry. My father said that although they are somewhat skilled, they are still far from the top experts in Snow Lotus City. He also said that these young heroes either had their brains kicked by a donkey when they were young, or their brains were clamped by a door when they grew up. He also said that if I see them, I must avoid them." Su Fengnian said earnestly, "Little girl, you don't understand. These young heroes with lofty ambitions are all young and promising. They have a bright future ahead of them. They will definitely become great heroes in the future." The young girl didn't pay any attention to this guy. She fiercely glared at the young man, Hong Shuji, and said, "Immortal sister?" The young man shrunk his neck and had a sudden inspiration. He began to apply what he had just learned and looked up at the moon. After the old man spoke, the tense situation suddenly took a turn for the worse. "This old man has heard of some of your master Lu Huaishi's deeds. He is clearly an ambitious person. Send a message to that whatever general's mansion. Tell him that as long as the one surnamed Lu is willing to offer 10 famous swords, 1,000 taels of gold, and a mansion with 100 maidservants, this old man will reluctantly become his chief guest. Even if he faces the top 10 experts in the world in the future, he will have the confidence to challenge them." The young man surnamed Shi, who still had blood on the corner of his mouth, looked uncertain. Finally, he smiled and cupped his fists. "As long as you can take down that eyesore swordsman and let me take the Snow Lotus, I will try my best to introduce you to my foster father." The youth panicked and shouted, "Old man, didn't you say you wanted to take me as your disciple? Didn't you say you would teach me the peerless martial arts that can easily make me the strongest person in the world?" The old man laughed and said, "Silly boy, with your coarse constitution, even if this old man gave you dozens of top-secret manuals, you still wouldn't be able to become an expert. If this old man hadn't said that, would you have helped me break the formation in the cave?" The old man suddenly looked at the sickly young man. Your aptitude is just a so-so. Do you want to be my disciple? This old man has made a comeback this time and is destined to be famous. As long as you agree, this old man will let you rise to the top. The old man changed the topic and looked at the young woman with the purple box on her back. She was really stunning. Even when he was unscrupulous in Jianghu, he had never seen such a beautiful woman. If he could use her as a cauldron, he might be able to return to the peak of martial arts. The old man didn't hide his greedy eyes. He smacked his lips and said with a smile, however, the girl beside you will belong to this old man. Such a first-grade cauldron, if I don't take it, I will be punished. As for you, young man, a girl is nothing. As long as you have the world's first-grade martial arts. Su Fengnian smiled and said, all right. I originally wanted to talk with you a bit. I wanted to hear about the Jianghu that the old man wearing the sheepskin coat was in. You, after all, are a Jianghu senior who fought with Dong Yuanrui of the Dongyue Sword Pond. Although you lost miserably and had your legs chopped off by the 6 caterpillars, it is not easy for you to live to this age. But since you can't accept it, then there is no other way. You should thank me. If it wasn't for me, you would be a corpse now. Jiang and I snorted coldly. Su Fengnian's smile disappeared. Speaking of which, if I'm not wrong, you're that notorious cauldron casting master, right? You're good at using women as cauldrons and using yin to supplement yang to increase your own cultivation. Even the devil's sex deer chasing mountain isn't willing to accept you. Dong Yuanrui, 6 caterpillars, tripod casting master, deer mountain. The old man who had struggled to break free from the prison in the snow-capped mountain cave was greatly shocked. Su Fengnian was probably tired from talking so much. He squatted down again and panted lightly. Except for Jiang and I, everyone was dumbfounded. Even the swordsman from the Central Plains turned pale with fright. Because no matter how hard he tried to suppress the sword across his knees, it would automatically fly out of the sheath. The flying sword slowly came to Su Fengnian's shoulder and slightly hummed, like a little bird relying on a man, like an old horse meeting its master. The old man was scared to death. He had been away from Jianghu for many years, but his eyesight was still there. The sword-controlling art of the Wu family's sword tomb. Chapter 1473. The old man hurriedly shouted, young master, let's talk nicely. Don't fight. It's not easy for you and me to reach our current cultivation. The flying sword pierced forward like a bolt of lightning. The old man couldn't care less about maintaining his posture of a cross-legged expert. He quickly jumped up a few feet and dodged the flying sword that nailed into the wall. The tip of the flying sword spun and retreated, leaving some yellow soil on the wall. After putting some distance between them, the flying sword pierced forward again. The old man, who had been pretending to be a grandmaster after leaving the house, knocked the wall with his elbow and tried to climb over the wall to escape. However, the flying sword suddenly accelerated and appeared above his head. The old man had no choice but to use the 1,000-pounds falling technique. The flying sword seemed to be teasing him. Every time, intentionally or unintentionally, the old man would be able to dodge the tip of the sword and avoid the miserable fate of being pierced through. However, he would never be able to leave the wall. The old lecher, who had been trapped in the snow mountain for dozens of years, felt like dying. He kept shouting some strange words that the people of Snow Lotus City couldn't understand. It's not the chi-controlling flying sword, it's the superior flying sword technique. Brat, who are you to the Wu family's sword tomb? Why is it that even though you didn't personally raise the other person's sword, it can still be guided by your divine intent? Could it be that you're the current Wu family's sword crown, and that girl is your sword maid? This old man knows his mistake, you brat. No, sir, please be merciful and spare her. What made the old man even more desperate was that the guy still had the leisure to raise his arm and pull out the knife, gently holding it in his hand. After half an hour, the exhausted old man was stabbed more than 20 times by the sword and hung on the wall through his mouth. The sword pierced through the wall, so it looked like a hanging corpse. Su Fengnian held the cold knife and glanced at the corpse. As if he still couldn't vent his anger, the flying sword flew out and stabbed into the wall again and again at a speed that was countless times faster than before. A series of banging sounds rang out. The corpse didn't even slide down half an inch. It was pierced into a pile of meat paste bit by bit. Su Fengnian stood up. When he looked at Lu Huaishi's adopted son, the latter crashed into the wall and died on the spot. The wall collapsed, and the two corpses disappeared from everyone's sight. What the eyes didn't see, their hearts didn't palpitate. After Su Fengnian sheathed his blade, he grabbed the scabbard that had flown back into his hand. He put the cold blade back into the scabbard and then hung it around his waist. Ignoring the group of night walkers in the alley and the Lu manor who were about to wet their pants, he made a face at the young man and woman and said with a smile, "How is it? Do you believe me now? For a true expert like me, there's no need for me to stand. Squatting is already very cool. If I were to stand, I would look so handsome that I wouldn't even dare to look in the mirror for fear of scaring myself. How could there be such a handsome and peerless expert in this world?" Jiang and I rolled his eyes and said, "Immoral." The young man stood in front of the young girl to protect her. The young girl hid behind the young man. Her teeth chattered as she whispered, "He's powerful, but his head must have been hit by a door before." The stubborn young girl pulled the young man's sleeve and asked, "Isn't that right, Twig?" The young man whispered, "Yes." However, he quickly pretended to be stupid and said, "Really?" With a thought, Su Fengnian made the long sword that he had borrowed for a moment fly back into the scabbard of the swordsman. He smiled and said, "Thank you." The man from the Central Plains, who had thought that he was already considered a top expert in the small snow lotus city of the western regions, stood up and said in a deep voice, "It should be me who is thanking Senior for teaching me how to use the sword." Su Fengnian dismissed him with a smile. Then, his entire aura changed and he no longer showed any signs of being defeated. He turned his head and said to Jiang and I, "In fact, my recovery is not slow. In fact, it's even faster than Tuoba Bodhisattva. I could walk on my own 2 days ago. Now, he and Li Mixi have entered the city. You have already saved me once. This time, I have a chance of winning. It's not certain that I will lose. Don't worry about me. Take these 2 kids and leave Snow Lotus City first. After settling them down, you can go back to West Chu." Su Fengnian paused for a moment. He blinked his eyes and said with a mischievous smile, "Maybe one day, I will go and find you. At that time, you will know how powerful I am and whether I am the new martial emperor or not." Su Fengnian walked toward the alley alone. He pressed his right hand on the cold saber's hilt and turned his back to Jiang and I. "Back then, when Chao Changqing took you away, I couldn't stop him. As long as I don't die this time, no one can stop me." At this moment, the young man and the young girl saw that the swordsman suddenly stagger and almost fall to the ground. The young girl, who had been inexplicably touched, couldn't help but laugh. "He looks more handsome when he is squatting." The young man nodded. The man from the Central Plains, who had already regarded the senior swordsman who was good at retaining his looks as an immortal, also couldn't bear to look. However, while he was filled with compassion, the swordsman was also shocked. Just now, he seemed to have heard the names Tuoba Bodhisattva and Chao Changqing. This senior was not only on the same side as Chao Changqing, but his opponent was also the second strongest in the world, Tuoba Bodhisattva. He was even worthy of Tuoba Bodhisattva joining forces with others to hunt him down to Snow Lotus City. Was this senior a sword immortal who had never appeared in Jianghu? However, in the next moment, he felt that it wasn't the case. In the distance, Jiang and I, whose face was stiff, came behind Su Fengnian with a long sweep. He kicked this guy to the ground and said angrily, "Are you addicted to pretending to be an expert?" Chapter 1474. Jiang and I stopped at the corner of the alley. During this escape, whether they should stop or continue, how they should fight if they stopped, whether it was a dragonfly skimming the water or not, it was all up to Su Fengnian. Tonight was not an exception. Slowly walking out of the alley, Su Fengnian gazed at the street. As expected, if one thought of the worst, that would be the case. It was very easy to worry about. If their luck was good, Li Mibi and Tuoba would enter the city half a day later. If their luck was average, the two would have already given up on him as bait and returned. Su Fengnian sighed and then looked at her with a complicated gaze. Jiang and I just quietly waited for the rest. Su Fengnian said softly, "This time, we won't follow the old rules. We have to keep an eye on that old dog Li Mixi." Those battles where Bodhisattva Tuoba was the target were actually just a smokescreen. Now that Tuoba has recovered some of his strength, he is determined to leave. Without Su Yanbing and the others stopping him, we will not be able to stop him. But like we said before, if the worst situation occurs, you retreat first, I will cover the rear. Jiang and I did not comment. She hesitated and then asked, "Do you know why Beimang is so relaxed with Gu Jiantang guarding the east?" Su Fengnian asked in response, "Is it because they are certain that the Liang imperial court will not move?" Jiang and I sneered, "So simple?" Su Fengnian leaned against the wall and said softly, "There is news in the spy report that there is a group of people in Great Peace City who cannot hold back. They boldly suggested that the two Liao border armies should not just stare at each other and that they should cooperate with Beimang. Of course, they could not be considered as reinforcements, but they could be like Ji Zhou's Yuan Tingshan and obtain a lot of merits." However, these voices were quickly suppressed by Gu Jiantang. Among them, Su Gong, who had been patrolling the border as assistant minister, had been strongly in favor of fighting at the start. But when he suddenly changed sides and did not mention anything about attacking, he caused a lot of criticism in Great Peace City. His already low reputation hit rock bottom. Some people even said that they wanted this assistant minister of the Ministry of War to be an assistant minister of the border for the rest of his life. Fu Shui Chamber only knows that Lu Xingxiang sent an urgent letter to the capital, directly to the Imperial Study Room. As for what the letter said, Fu Shui Chamber does not have the ability to find out. Jiang and I wanted to say something but hesitated. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Let's not talk about it. I'll just treat it as an accident on the Eastern Front. In any case, I can't care about the life and death of the two Liao countries. If the Eastern Front is ruined, it will only be Gu Jintang's headache." Jiang and I did not give a direct answer. "Who do you think hates Gu Jiantang the most in the world?" Su Fengnian paused. Gu Jiantang was able to become one of the four great generals of the spring and autumn period because of his contribution in destroying the country. Not to mention the southern Tang, they did not fight much. However, when they took down Dongyue, they fought some exciting battles. The only people who have a deep hatred for Gu Jiantang should be the people of Dongyue. Su Fengnian said to herself, "But even the royal family of Dongyue has been subdued. Most of the slightly famous generals are dead." The civil officials of Dongyue were the first to submit to the Zhao clan in Liang. They became Zhang Jiulu's lackeys in the early years of the struggle between the Zhang and the Gu. In particular, almost half of the officials of the 5 departments outside of the Censorate and the Ministry of War were Dongyue civil officials. The most famous pair of censors, father and son, impeached Gu Jintang's Ministry of War every year for 10 years after Yonghui Empress. But these people, to be honest, are just scratching an itch for Gu Jiantang, the pillar of the country. Perhaps Gu Jiantang of the two Liao countries would like them to scold him a few more times. Otherwise, he would not be able to hold his position. When a general is outside, he is never afraid of the civil officials of the internal court. On the contrary, he is afraid that his reputation is too good. Jiang and I sneered. Su Fengnian suddenly understood and said, "Oh." She asked doubtfully, "You really guessed it?" Su Fengnian nodded. Jiang and I curled her lips in disdain. Su Fengnian said, "Isn't it just Wang Sui?" She opened her eyes wide. Su Fengnian blinked. "Really?" She shook her head vigorously. Su Fengnian looked helpless. The two riders rushed to Snow Lotus City. After entering the city, the sound of the horses' hooves hitting the bluestone slabs seemed insignificant in the noisy nightless city. A few drunkards were squatting on the street outside the tavern to vomit. They inadvertently looked up and saw the faces of the two riders reflected in the dim light. They did not pay much attention to it. They could not suppress the movement of their throats and threw up in the direction of the two riders. After vomiting to their heart's content, they felt a lot more comfortable. However, they found that one of the white-haired riders was looking at them coldly. The drunkard grinned and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Unexpectedly, as if lightning had ignited the fire on the ground, his stomach started to churn again. He put his hands on the ground and vomited. Then, he felt that something was wrong. He shook his head and tried to open his eyes wide. Only then did he see a pool of blood on the slate. Then, his head hit the ground heavily and he never had the chance to open his eyes again. Drunk to death, drunk to death. The drunkard died drunk like this. The other dispirited middle-aged rider did not say anything about the old man's venting of anger. If he were in the old man's shoes, he would also have the thought of killing people indiscriminately. The old man had set up 2 big traps. The first time was to kill Yan Wenluan. This time, he wanted to kill Su Fengnian. Almost half of the top masters in Beimeng Jianghu were killed. The most important thing was that they did not succeed. The spider web that spread all the way from the southern dynasties to Beiliang was also torn into pieces. No matter how calm the old man was, he could not help but feel angry. The white-haired old man probably also realized that he had lost his composure. He laughed at himself and said softly, "King of the Northern Courtyard, please allow me to make one last bet. I bet that the guy surnamed Su Fengnian will not be willing to let the fight end in a draw. He will personally take the risk and wait for us in Snow Lotus City to take the bait. Su Yanbing and Tantai Pingjing will arrive in about 12 hours. During this period, if Su Fengnian not only takes the initiative to show up, but also deliberately shows his flaws and runs in circles with us, I can promise you that no matter how rare the opportunity is, I will stop and return to the north with peace of mind. I will leave Snow Lotus City before Su Yanbing and Tantai Pingjing enter the city."